For 35 years, I thought my husband Marcus and I were building an unshakable legacy together. I was the financial brain behind his logistics company, working late nights to make sure every single dollar was accounted for and our family was secure. But 3 days after we put him in the ground, his corporate attorney called me gasping for air. He gave me an address in Marthas Vineyard and begged me to get there before they destroyed the evidence. When I punched in the door code and walked into a $5 million beachfront mansion I had never seen before, I did not find a grieving family in mourning. I found my daughter Jada, her husband Preston, and my mother-in-law Estelle, clinking expensive champagne glasses. Jada just swirled her drink, looked me up and down with absolute disgust, and said, "You were not supposed to find out until the eviction notice hit your mailbox, Mom." My name is Clarice. I am 60 years old and a retired certified public accountant. Before I tell you exactly how I used my financial expertise to legally strip them of everything they loved, tell me where you are watching from in the comments below. And if you know what it is like to have your own blood try to dig your grave while smiling in your face, hit the like button and subscribe. The smell of white lilies and catered fried chicken hung heavy in my living room. It was the afternoon of Marcus' funeral, and my feet were completely numb from standing in heels all day. I wanted nothing more than to sit in silence and process the fact that my husband of over 3 decades was truly gone. But my mother-in-law Estelle made sure peace was entirely out of the question. She stood near the buffet table wearing a black tailored dress that cost more than my first car, loudly complaining to anyone who would listen. "This chicken is drier than dust," she announced, making sure her shrill voice carried across the crowded room. I do not know why Clarice insisted on this cheap catering company for such an important day. My Marcus worked so hard his whole life building an empire, and he deserved a premium spread for his homegoing. Not this budget meal. I took a deep breath, smoothing down my simple black skirt. Estelle had hated me since the day Marcus brought me home 35 years ago. She came from old money that had long dried up, but she still clung desperately to the arrogance and the country club attitude. She always felt that Marcus settling for a dark-skinned woman who grew up clipping coupons in a tiny apartment was a complete disgrace to their family name. She did not care that my frugal habits and my accounting degree were exactly what saved her son from total bankruptcy 20 years ago. When his first business venture failed, it was my salary and my financial planning that kept a roof over their heads. But to Estelle, I was just the help who happened to wear a wedding ring. I walked past her without a single word, keeping my dignity intact. I was not going to give her the satisfaction of an argument at my husband's repast. That is when I noticed my daughter Jada and her husband Preston standing in the far corner by the patio doors. They did not look like two people who had just buried a father and a father-in-law. Jada was 34 years old, wearing a designer black dress that dipped a little too low for a grieving daughter. Preston, a 36-year-old white man who always treated my home like a luxury hotel he forgot to leave a review for, was whispering intently in her ear. He held a glass of champagne which he had clearly brought himself, since I certainly did not serve alcohol at a repast. Jada giggled. She actually giggled at her own father's funeral. Preston tapped his glass against hers in a quiet secret toast. He leaned in and kissed her cheek, looking incredibly smug. A cold, heavy knot formed deep in my stomach. Something was very wrong. As a mother and an auditor, I have a sixth sense for when the numbers do not add up, and right now the behavior in my living room was completely out of balance. I walked toward them, but before I could reach the patio doors, my phone vibrated intensely in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw the name Sterling flashing on the screen. He was the corporate attorney for the logistics company Marcus and I owned. I stepped away from the crowd and slipped into the quiet hallway, pressing the phone to my ear. Before I could even say hello, Sterling was speaking so fast he was barely making sense. "Clarice," he panted. "Clarice, you need to leave the house right now." His voice was shaking with what sounded like pure terror. "Sterling," I whispered, looking over my shoulder to make sure no one was listening to me. "It is the repast. I cannot just leave my guests. What is going on?" "I am looking at the private ledger, Clarice. The one Marcus kept locked out of the main system. I just found it in a hidden file." They are moving fast. Preston is already trying to file the paperwork to lock you out of everything. Lock me out of what I asked my CPA brain, instantly switching on and overriding my grief. I control the corporate account, Sterling. I have the master access. Not this one, Clarice. He took a ragged, desperate breath. Grab a pen. Write down this address right now. It is in Oak Bluffs, Marthas Vineyard. I frowned, staring at the wall. We do not own property in Marthas Vineyard, Sterling. You do now, he said. Or rather, you did. Clarice, listen to me carefully. You need to get to that house tonight before Preston and Jada clear out the home office in the basement. I do not know what Preston is planning, but he sent me a threatening email an hour ago demanding the final trust documents. The door code is 8421. Go now, Clarice. He hung up before I could ask another question. I stood in the dim hallway staring at the blank screen of my phone. The cold knot in my stomach turned into a solid block of ice. I looked back into the living room. Estelle was now talking to Jada and Preston. The three of them were huddled together, looking incredibly satisfied and entirely too happy for a family in mourning. I did not scream. I did not make a scene or throw anyone out. I am a professional. I went straight to my bedroom, grabbed my heavy coat, my purse, and my car keys. I slipped out the back door, leaving the cheap chicken, the fake tears, and the whispering relatives behind me. The drive to the ferry terminal was an absolute blur. The boat ride across the dark water to the vineyard felt like an eternity. The cold ocean wind whipped violently against the windows of the ferry, but I felt absolutely nothing. My mind was racing, pulling up every balance sheet, every tax return, every expense report I had ever filed for the logistics company over the last decade. Where did the money come from? How did Marcus hide a massive property purchase in Oak Bluffs from his own wife, who happened to be his chief financial officer? It was pitch black by the time I pulled my car onto the pristine, crushed gravel driveway of the address Sterling had given me. I stopped the engine and just stared through the windshield. It was a massive 3-story beachfront villa with beautiful wraparound porches and huge floor-to-ceiling windows facing the ocean. The lights were blazing brightly inside. Smooth jazz music was playing loudly enough that I could hear it from the driveway. I walked up the wide wooden front steps. My hands were remarkably steady as I punched the numbers 8421 into the electronic keypad. The heavy double doors clicked and swung open. I stepped inside. The massive foyer was lined with imported marble. A giant crystal chandelier hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting a warm glow over the expensive artwork on the walls. Straight ahead in the sprawling living room were Jada, Preston, and Estelle. They had not heard me come in over the loud music. Estelle was sitting comfortably on a plush white sofa, her expensive shoes kicked off, holding a large glass of red wine. Preston was standing by a custom wet bar, pouring himself another heavy drink. Jada was dancing lightly to the jazz music, looking around the beautiful room like she owned the entire world. "Hello," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the large room like a sharp blade. The three of them froze instantly. Preston nearly dropped the heavy bottle of liquor onto the marble counter. Estelle gasped and completely spilled her red wine onto the pristine white rug. Jada slowly turned around. The color completely drained from my daughter's face for a split second before her posture stiffened. She looked at me, standing in the doorway in my simple black funeral clothes. Then she looked over at her smirking husband and her arrogant grandmother. The initial shock on her face quickly melted into a slow, cruel, and calculating smirk. She did not apologize. She did not ask how I found them. She just raised her martini glass toward me in a mock toast. "You were not supposed to find out until the eviction notice hit your mailbox, Mom." The laughter echoed off the high vaulted ceilings of the massive living room, bouncing against the expensive crystal chandelier and sinking deep into my tired bones. Jada, my own flesh and blood, stood there, holding her martini glass high in the air with a look of absolute triumph on her face. For a brief, terrifying moment, I thought the profound grief of burying my husband of 35 years had finally caused my mind to completely shatter. I thought I was hallucinating this entire nightmare, but then Preston, her husband, started to laugh along with her. It was not a nervous or uncomfortable chuckle to break the tension. It was a deep, booming sound of pure, unadulterated victory. He walked over to my daughter and wrapped his arm tightly around her waist, pulling her close as if they were celebrating a massive lottery win instead of mourning a dead man. Jada joined in with a high-pitched giggle that made my stomach turn completely upside down. They were laughing at me. They were laughing at the woman who had just left the funeral reception of her husband hours ago to rush across the dark ocean because she thought her family was in terrible legal danger. I stood perfectly still on the imported marble floor of the grand foyer. My black funeral heels clicked slightly as I shifted my weight, but my face remained a mask of absolute stone. I refused to give them the sick satisfaction of seeing my heart break into a million pieces. My eyes slowly scanned the massive space around me. My brain, which had spent 4 decades working as a certified public accountant, could not help but automatically calculate the sheer astronomical cost of my surroundings. The custom crown molding lining the high ceilings. The huge floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the dark, crashing waves of the Atlantic Ocean. The pristine white leather furniture set, and the modern custom-built wet bar stocked with top-shelf premium liquor. This was easily a $5 million property located in one of the most exclusive zip codes in the country. The financial betrayal felt infinitely heavier than the emotional one. Where had the money come from? I managed every single ledger for our shared logistics company. I tracked every single penny that went in and out of our joint accounts. The horrifying realization that Marcus had successfully hidden a fortune of this magnitude from me felt like a physical knife twisting deep into my spine. Preston took a long, arrogant sip of his dark liquor and looked at me with a smirk that I had always absolutely despised. He stepped forward, acting like the lord of the manor, spreading his arms wide to show off the extravagant room. "Do you like it, Clarice?" he asked, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. "Marcus bought this place 5 years ago. 5 whole years you were sitting in that stuffy old suburban house clipping grocery coupons and making us eat generic brand cereal while Marcus was building a beautiful paradise for his real family." Jada nodded her head in eager agreement, taking another long sip of her drink. "Daddy knew you would never ever approve of this," she said, rolling her eyes like a spoiled teenager instead of a 34-year-old grown woman. "You are way too obsessed with saving pennies to ever actually enjoy life. You would have made him sell it immediately or rent it out to strangers just to make a tiny little profit. You never wanted us to have anything nice. He wanted me to have a safe, beautiful place where my children could grow up with the kind of luxury he always desperately wanted for himself." The sheer audacity of her words was blinding. For 5 entire years, my husband had been secretly siphoning massive amounts of money out of our lives to buy a beachfront mansion in Marthas Vineyard for his spoiled daughter and her entitled white husband, all while I was agonizing over our retirement funds and health insurance premiums. Before I could even formulate a proper response to Jada's ridiculous and deeply offensive statement, my mother-in-law Estelle walked slowly across the expensive white rug. She was holding a fresh glass of dark red wine, completely unbothered by the fact that she had just ruined the rug earlier. She looked around the beautiful room with a proud and highly satisfied smile on her heavily wrinkled face. "It really is a gorgeous property," she said, her shrill, grating voice cutting right through the smooth jazz music playing softly in the background. I told Marcus he needed a place that truly reflected his elevated status in the business world. Estelle stopped next to Preston and looked at me with a cold, calculating stare. A man of his wealth and prestige cannot be confined to a boring brick house in a middle-class neighborhood forever, she continued, smoothing down her expensive black dress. I looked at Estelle, feeling the cold, burning rage rising fast in my throat. "You knew I asked," my voice dangerously low and steady. Estelle laughed, a dry, harsh sound that scraped painfully against my ears. "Of course I knew, Clarice. Who do you think helped him pick out all the expensive furniture? I spent weeks coordinating with the best interior designers in the entire state. We had to make sure everything was completely perfect for Jada and Preston. We certainly could not let you decorate the place. You would have furnished a $5 million luxury villa with discount items from a cheap clearance department store." Estelle took a slow sip of her wine and looked me up and down with absolute unfiltered disgust. "Marcus deserved beauty, Clarice. He deserved pure elegance and sophistication, something you could never give him no matter how hard you tried to pretend you fit into our upper-class world. You were always just a poor girl from the wrong side of the tracks playing dress-up in my son's house. The disrespect was so thick and heavy in the room it was almost completely suffocating. I felt my hands ball into tight, shaking fists at my sides, but I forced my fingers to slowly relax. I deal in hard facts and financial figures, not emotional temper tantrums. I looked directly into Jada's eyes, ignoring the other two entirely. Your father did not build his wealth by himself, Jada. He did not just wake up one day with millions of dollars to throw at beachfront property and custom wet bars. I built that logistics company from the absolute ground up with my own 2 hands. Jada scoffed loudly, waving her manicured hand dismissively in the air. Oh, please, Mom. Daddy was the true visionary of the family. He made all the big corporate deals. He shook all the important hands and wined and dined the clients. You just did the boring paperwork in the back room where nobody had to look at you. The absolute staggering ignorance in her voice made me want to shake her until she finally woke up to reality. Just the paperwork, I repeated, my voice rising just a fraction of an inch, echoing slightly in the large foyer. When his first business went completely bankrupt 20 years ago, it was my perfect credit score that kept us from living on the absolute street. It was my salary from my accounting firm that fed you and put warm clothes on your back while he was sitting on the couch, feeling sorry for himself and trying to figure out his life. When he finally started the logistics company, he could not even secure a tiny small business loan because his financial history was a complete and total disaster. I took a firm step forward, my presence commanding the room, demanding the respect I had earned. I am the one who legally structured the corporation. I am the one who tirelessly audited the books, worked 80-hour weeks, and managed the entire payroll so he could play the big boss and look important for his country club friends. He took all the public credit, but my sweat, my intelligence, and my careful financial strategy built every single dime in his bank account. Without me, your father would have died a completely broke man. Preston sneered, slamming his empty crystal glass onto the marble counter. It made a sharp cracking sound that echoed loudly over the music. You always overstate your importance, Clarice. You were just a glorified bookkeeper pushing pencils. Marcus was the chief executive officer. It was his company, his money, and his final decision on exactly how to spend it. And he decided that he did not want to spend his golden years listening to you constantly lecture him about taxes and profit margins. He wanted to secure a massive legacy for Jada. He wanted to make sure she was taken care of for the rest of her life because he knew you would try to selfishly control her inheritance. Control her inheritance. I shot back instantly, taking another aggressive step toward him. You mean stop you from draining her accounts to fund your utterly failed investments? Preston, do not think I do not know about your little tech business ventures that never seem to turn a single dollar of actual profit. You have been living completely off my husband's generosity since the day you married my daughter, playing the role of a highly successful finance bro while bringing absolutely nothing of value to the table. Preston's face turned bright, angry red. The smug, wealthy facade slipped for just a second, revealing the angry, deeply insecure little boy hiding underneath. He hated that I saw right through his tailored, expensive suits and his fake, unearned confidence. He hated that an older black woman from a working-class background could look at his financial statements and know immediately that he was a complete and total fraud living on borrowed time and stolen money. But then the arrogant, cruel smirk slowly returned to his face. He turned around and opened a sleek, expensive leather briefcase sitting on one of the bar stools. He reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of official legal documents bound tightly by a heavy blue cover. He walked deliberately back to the center of the kitchen and threw the documents violently onto the massive marble island. The heavy thud echoed loudly in the silent, tense room. He tapped his index finger aggressively on the top page, looking at me with pure venom shining in his pale eyes. "Read it, Clarice," he demanded, his voice echoing with absolute manufactured authority. I did not move a single inch. I just stared calmly at the official legal seal stamped proudly onto the front page of the thick packet. Preston leaned forward, resting both his hands heavily on the cold marble. "It is a legally stamped deed of trust. The limited liability company owns this house free and clear, and Marcus left 100% of the limited liability company directly to Jada." Jada smiled broadly, stepping up next to her husband and wrapping her arm proudly around his bicep, leaning her head on his shoulder. Daddy made sure the trust was completely ironclad, Mom. He hired the best estate lawyers in the entire state to make sure you could never touch a single brick of this house. Preston picked up the heavy document and shoved it aggressively closer to me across the smooth counter, stopping just inches from my hands. You get the old suburban house and his remaining medical debt, Clarice. That is exactly what you get. Now get off my property before I call the police and have you dragged out of here for trespassing. The heavy stack of legal documents rested on the cold marble island like a physical weapon designed to destroy my entire life. A normal woman might have screamed loudly at the sheer audacity of the betrayal. A normal woman might have thrown the expensive crystal glasses against the custom-painted walls and demanded answers from the people who had just stolen her future. But I was not just a grieving widow standing in a luxury home. I was a certified public accountant with 4 decades of experience hunting down financial deception and corporate fraud. I did not cry a single tear. I did not raise my voice or show any emotion. I simply reached out with a perfectly steady hand and pulled the heavy packet of papers toward me across the smooth counter. My eyes scanned the dense legal text with practiced clinical precision. I checked the filing dates listed at the top. I checked the routing numbers and the official notary seal stamped firmly on the bottom of the last page. Everything was perfectly in order. The entity listed as the sole owner of the $5 million beachfront property was named Ocean View Holdings Limited Liability Company. The paperwork clearly designated my daughter Jada as the singular beneficiary of this entity upon the death of my husband Marcus. The legal phrasing was absolutely ironclad and impenetrable. Marcus had clearly paid top dollar for an aggressive attorney who specialized in hiding assets and bypassing probate court entirely. He had intentionally structured this entire transaction to make sure I would be left standing in the cold with absolutely nothing but his outstanding medical bills and a heavily mortgaged house in the dreary suburbs. The betrayal was so deep and so mathematically precise that it completely took my breath away. He had planned this elaborate trap for 5 whole years. While I was sitting at the dining room table late at night, balancing our checkbooks and stressing over how to keep his logistics company afloat, he was secretly funneling a massive fortune into a shadow company to buy a vacation home for a daughter who completely despised me. Preston leaned heavily over the marble island, watching my eyes track carefully across the pages. He was practically vibrating with excitement, waiting for me to finally break down and cry. When I remained completely silent, the disappointment on his face became painfully obvious. He wanted a show. He wanted the angry black woman stereotype to manifest right there in his kitchen so he could feel completely justified in his cruelty. Jada stepped forward, her designer heels clicking loudly on the imported floor. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest and looked at me with a sickening mixture of pity and absolute disdain. "You are probably wondering why he did it, Mom," she said, her voice soft but laced with pure poison. "You are probably wondering why a man would lie to his wife for 5 whole years and hide a house like this." I slowly looked up from the documents and met my daughter's eyes. I did not speak a single word. I let the silence stretch out, making her incredibly uncomfortable in her own newly acquired home. Jada shifted her weight nervously and continued speaking. "He did it because he hated coming home to you, Mom. He hated walking into that boring house and listening to you complain endlessly about the electric bill and the price of groceries. He was a powerful man building a massive corporate empire, and you treated him like a child who did not know how to manage his own allowance. He told me he felt completely suffocated by your constant financial paranoia. He wanted to feel like a king, and you made him feel like a prisoner in his own marriage. This house, this beautiful mansion by the ocean, was his only escape from you. He came here to breathe. He came here to actually be happy." Her words were explicitly designed to completely destroy whatever was left of my broken heart. They were designed to erase 35 years of loyal marriage and reduce my entire existence to a miserable burden. Estelle nodded enthusiastically in the background, taking another heavy sip of her expensive dark wine. "She always was a suffocating woman," Estelle chimed in, her voice grating against my ears. "No style, no grace, just spreadsheets and endless complaints." Marcus finally found his absolute peace here, and he made sure his real family would get to keep it forever. I took a slow, deep breath. The emotional pain in my chest was excruciating, but I locked it away in a tight box deep inside my mind. I would mourn my dead husband later. I would mourn the painful loss of my daughter later. Right now, I was standing on an active battlefield, and I needed to gather my ammunition. I did not argue with them. I did not defend my choices or remind Jada that my financial paranoia was the only reason she was able to attend a prestigious private university without taking out a single student loan. Explaining reality to arrogant people who are entirely committed to their own delusions is a complete waste of precious time. Preston grew incredibly tired of the silence. He stood up straight and pointed a long, aggressive finger toward the massive double doors of the foyer. "You have seen the official paperwork, Clarice," he said, his voice hard and commanding. "The house legally belongs to Jada. You have absolutely no right to be standing on this property anymore. I want you to turn around and walk out that door right now. If you are not off my driveway in exactly 60 seconds, I am going to call the local police and have you arrested for criminal trespassing." I am sure the authorities would love to hear about the bitter, grieving widow who broke into her daughter's home to cause a violent scene. I looked at Preston. I looked at his expensive tailored suit that he undoubtedly bought with my stolen money. I looked at his arrogant white face, flushed with the sick thrill of putting an older black woman in her place. I reached calmly into my coat pocket and pulled out my cell phone. Preston tensed up immediately, reaching for his own phone in his pocket, probably ready to dial emergency services just like he threatened. But I did not make a call. I simply opened my camera application. I held the phone steadily over the heavy legal document resting on the marble island. I lined up the camera lens perfectly with the section of the page that listed the exact name of the shell company: Ocean View Holdings Limited Liability Company. I snapped a clear, high-resolution photograph. The artificial shutter sound of the camera echoed sharply in the quiet kitchen. "What are you doing?" Preston demanded, his voice suddenly filled with a tiny sliver of nervous uncertainty. "You cannot take pictures of private legal documents." I smiled. It was not a warm smile or a sad smile. It was a chilling, calculated pulling back of my lips that did not reach my eyes. It was the smile of an apex predator who had just found the exact fatal weakness in the armor of her prey. "I am just keeping a record for my personal files." "Preston," I said, my voice entirely smooth and unbothered. "As you know, I am very obsessed with the tiny details." I slowly turned around and began to walk toward the front door. The sound of my heels clicking heavily on the imported marble floors was the only noise in the massive house. They watched me leave in complete stunned silence. They had expected me to fight tooth and nail. They had expected me to scream and beg for my share. My quiet, dignified retreat completely unnerved them. I pushed open the heavy double doors and walked out into the freezing night air. The cold ocean wind hit my face, but I felt entirely warm inside. I walked to my car, started the engine, and drove away from the $5 million mansion without looking back a single time. The next morning, the bright sun was barely rising over the cold city of Boston when I parked my car outside the tall glass office building of our corporate attorney. I did not wait for a polite invitation from the receptionist. I walked straight into the empty lobby, took the private elevator to the 14th floor, and pushed open the heavy glass doors of the law firm. Sterling was already sitting at his massive wooden desk. He looked like he had not slept in several days. His tie was loose, his expensive shirt was terribly wrinkled, and there were dark, heavy purple circles under his panicked eyes. When he saw me walk into his office, he practically jumped out of his expensive leather chair. "Clarice," he stammered nervously, running a shaking hand through his thinning hair. "Did you go to the house last night? Did you see what they did with the paperwork? Preston called my personal cell phone 3 times this morning. He is completely unhinged, Clarice. He is threatening to report me to the State Bar Association if I do not immediately turn over the remaining corporate tax files to him. He says he is the legal executor of the entire estate now, and he is going to destroy my career if I communicate with you in any way." I walked over to the heavy wooden door of his office and locked it with a loud, solid click. I pulled out one of the comfortable leather guest chairs and sat down directly across from him. "Preston is not going to destroy anything, Sterling," I said calmly, pulling my sleek silver laptop out of my leather tote bag. "Preston is an arrogant child playing a very dangerous game of Monopoly with real money. And he just made a completely fatal mistake." He showed me his cards. I opened my laptop and powered it on. The bright screen glowed beautifully in the dim morning light of the office. "What are you doing?" Sterling asked, walking quickly around his desk and hovering nervously over my shoulder. "Clarice, we need to be very careful here. If Marcus signed those trust documents completely legally, there is absolutely nothing we can do to stop them. The property is gone. The business accounts are tied up in probate court. We cannot fight a limited liability company that was successfully established 5 whole years ago." I ignored his desperate panic. I opened my private forensic accounting software. This was not the standard commercial software we used for the logistics company every day. This was a highly advanced proprietary program I had custom-built years ago to track complex tax irregularities and untangle deep, complicated financial webs. It was the digital equivalent of a ruthless bloodhound. I pulled out my phone and opened the photograph I had taken the night before. I stared intensely at the name of the shell company, Ocean View Holdings Limited Liability Company. Marcus was a relatively smart man when it came to logistics and trucking routes, but he was an absolute idiot when it came to forensic finance. He always thought moving money through a few different banks made it completely invisible to the world. He never understood that every single digital transaction leaves a permanent, unerasable fingerprint. Every wire transfer, every cashier check, every routing number leaves a massive trail of breadcrumbs that can be easily followed if you know exactly how to look. I typed the specific name of the shell company into the global search bar of my forensic software. I linked the deep search directly to the massive database of our corporate tax records and our personal joint bank accounts spanning the last 10 years. I hit the Enter key with authority. The software began to run immediately. Lines of complex code and hidden financial data scrolled rapidly down the dark screen. Sterling watched with his mouth hanging slightly open, clearly not understanding the complex algorithms processing right before his tired eyes. The search took exactly 4 agonizing minutes. For 4 minutes, the office was completely silent, except for the soft hum of the computer processor and Sterling's heavy nervous breathing right behind me. Suddenly, the screen stopped scrolling completely. A loud digital chime sounded sharply from the computer speakers. The entire display flashed a bright, vibrant, angry red. A massive, heavily detailed transaction tree populated on the screen, connecting Ocean View Holdings Limited Liability Company to a very specific private banking routing number. I clicked on the routing number and expanded the hidden digital file. The original source of the massive initial deposit used to purchase the Marthas Vineyard property was displayed clearly in bold black letters. I sat back in my chair and stared hard at the glowing screen. A slow, deep sense of absolute victory washed over me completely, replacing the lingering heavy grief of my husband's death. The complicated puzzle pieces finally snapped perfectly into place, revealing the entire ugly picture. Sterling leaned much closer to the screen, squinting his tired eyes at the complex financial data. "Clarice, what is this?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly in the quiet room. "What did you just find in the system? Where did Marcus get the $5 million to buy that massive house?" I turned my head and looked up at the terrified corporate lawyer. My lips slowly curled into a sharp, predatory smirk that promised absolute destruction for anyone who stood in my way. "Sterling," I said, my voice dripping with cold, calculated certainty. "Marcus did not buy this house with his business money. He bought it with mine." I left Sterling's office feeling a dangerous mixture of absolute clarity and burning rage. The drive back to my quiet suburban home, the house Marcus and I had shared for decades, felt incredibly surreal. The streets looked exactly the same. The trees were still blowing in the cold wind, but my entire reality had shifted fundamentally. I went straight to my home office and locked the heavy wooden door firmly behind me. I spread the printed financial records across my large oak desk, the papers spilling over the edges and covering the carpet. I spent hours meticulously tracing the digital footprints of the stolen money. It was not just the initial $5 million for the house in Marthas Vineyard. That was only the very top of a massive rotting iceberg. There were massive gaping holes in the corporate operating accounts spanning several years. Phantom vendors had been created out of thin air, overpaid invoices were routed to dummy accounts, and mysterious consulting fees were bleeding the logistics company completely dry. I was building an airtight timeline matching every single fraudulent transfer to the exact dates Preston and Jada took their lavish vacations or bought their expensive new cars. I was so deeply focused on untangling this intricate web of corporate fraud that I almost did not hear the loud, disruptive rumbling noise outside my front window. The heavy grinding sound of a large diesel engine completely broke my intense concentration. I stood up from my desk, my back aching slightly from leaning over the paperwork, and walked over to the front window. I pulled back the heavy fabric curtains just enough to look outside. A massive white commercial moving truck was backing slowly and aggressively into my driveway. The driver was completely ignoring the boundaries of the pavement, crushing my perfectly manicured flower beds beneath the massive, heavy tires. Two large men wearing matching blue company uniforms jumped out of the wide cab and loudly lowered the heavy metal ramp. Right behind the moving truck, Preston's sleek black sports car pulled sharply up to the curb, parking illegally in front of a fire hydrant. Jada stepped out of the passenger side, wearing dark designer sunglasses, acting as if she were arriving at a luxury resort instead of the suburban home she grew up in, and right behind her, adjusting an expensive silk scarf around her wrinkled neck, was my mother-in-law, Estelle. I walked out of my office down the long hallway and pulled open my front door just as Preston was walking arrogantly up the concrete steps. He did not bother to ring the bell or offer a simple basic greeting. He immediately held up a single official-looking sheet of paper, aggressively thrusting it toward my face. "We are here for the assets, Clarice," he announced loudly, his voice echoing down the quiet street, making sure the movers could hear his manufactured authority. Marcus specifically outlined in his final will that all valuable assets and expensive art located in the primary residence belong exclusively to Jada. He wanted to make sure his true legacy was preserved and not sold off in some cheap estate sale. Jada walked up the steps right behind him, slowly removing her expensive sunglasses. "Daddy knew you would try to pawn his beautiful things the moment he was gone," she said, her voice laced with that familiar, sickening superiority that she had learned directly from her grandmother. "We are just here to secure what is rightfully mine. You have absolutely no eye for quality, Mom, and Daddy wanted his grandchildren to inherit the finer things in life." Estelle brushed violently past both of them, ignoring my physical presence completely as she stepped right into my personal foyer. She looked around my perfectly clean home with absolute unmasked disgust, like she was inspecting a dirty roadside motel room. She immediately pointed her long, bony finger straight toward the archway of the formal living room. The piano, she commanded, her shrill voice echoing sharply off the walls. "Grab that grand piano first. It is the only thing in this miserable house worth a single dime." The piano was not just a simple piece of furniture to me. It was a beautiful antique mahogany grand piano that I had purchased with my very first major corporate bonus after securing a massive international client for my accounting firm 25 years ago. I bought it because I truly loved classical music and because it represented my own intense hard work, my long late-night hours, and my total financial independence. Marcus had never touched a single key on that elegant instrument in his entire miserable life. He barely even knew how to turn on a radio. But Estelle had always deeply hated that I owned something so incredibly elegant and sophisticated. She felt it elevated my status above my working-class background, and she despised that. I felt a sudden, massive surge of highly protective anger flare deep in my chest. I stepped quickly and deliberately in front of the living room archway, physically blocking the wide path of the two large movers who were currently holding thick padded blankets and heavy lifting straps. "Nobody is touching that piano," I said, my voice incredibly low and remarkably dangerous. "That piano legally and morally belongs to me. I bought it with my own personal funds decades before Marcus even thought about creating his little secret trust fund for his spoiled child." Preston scoffed loudly, stepping closer and shoving the piece of paper aggressively toward my chest. The will clearly states all valuable assets in the primary residence, Clarice. It does not matter who originally swiped their credit card 20 years ago. You were legally married under the law, and the item is currently residing inside his primary house. Now get out of the way before things get incredibly ugly for you. I stood my absolute ground, planting my feet firmly into the smooth hardwood floor. I crossed my arms tightly over my chest and looked directly into his arrogant pale blue eyes. "I am not moving a single inch, Preston," I stated firmly. "You are not coming into my personal home and taking my hard-earned property to furnish your stolen beach house. You have already taken enough from me." Preston took a slow, deliberate step forward, completely invading my personal space. He was a tall, heavy-set white man, and he used his physical size highly intentionally, trying to physically force me to step backward out of the entryway. He leaned his face down toward mine, his hot breath smelling faintly of expensive breath mints and stale dark coffee. "Listen to me very carefully, Clarice," he whispered, his voice dripping with pure malicious aggressive intent. "You are acting very hostile right now. You are acting deeply unhinged, emotional, and completely out of control. If you do not step aside, right this exact second, I am going to pull out my cell phone and call the local police department. I am going to tell the dispatch officer that an aggressive black woman is violently threatening the legal executors of an estate and physically preventing us from safely retrieving our lawful property." The violent threat hung in the air, heavy and absolutely suffocating. It was a sickeningly familiar and historically dangerous tactic. He was using his inherent white privilege as a direct weapon, relying heavily on the deeply ingrained systemic prejudices of society to force me into total submission. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that if the armed police arrived at my house, they would see a wealthy, calm white man wearing a designer suit, holding a legal document, and an angry black woman blocking a doorway, refusing to comply. He was banking entirely on my highly justified fear of that exact deadly scenario. Jada stood quietly behind him, watching the entire exchange with a cold, detached expression on her face. She was perfectly willing to let her own husband threaten her biological mother with potential police violence just to get a piece of old polished wood. Estelle just tapped her expensive leather shoe impatiently on the floorboards, clearly annoyed by the slight delay in her grand robbery. I looked up at Preston, and for a brief, blinding moment, the urge to strike him across his smug face was almost completely overwhelming. The sheer disrespect was a physical weight on my shoulders. But I am an expert forensic accountant. I do not deal in temporary emotional outbursts or violent physical reactions. I deal in long-term calculated massive returns. I quickly assessed the entire dangerous situation in my highly logical mind. The mahogany piano was incredibly valuable, yes, but it was just a material object made of wood and wire. Getting violently arrested in my own living room over a piece of furniture would entirely jeopardize everything I was currently building behind the scenes. It would give Preston the perfect legal ammunition to file a permanent restraining order or drag me into a lengthy, messy probate court battle that would deeply distract me from the real, massive prize waiting at the very end of this war. I stared deep into his pale eyes, memorizing the exact shade of his arrogant, unearned confidence. I memorized the slight smirk playing on his thin lips. Then I took a slow, deliberate, and highly calculated step to the side, completely clearing the entrance to the living room. Preston smirked a sickeningly triumphant smile spreading completely across his face. He actually thought he had won the war. He actually thought he had permanently broken my spirit and put me exactly in my designated place. "Good choice, Clarice," he mocked, straightening his expensive silk tie and stepping back. "Go ahead, boys, get it out of here and be very careful not to scratch the hardwood floors on your way out." I stood completely silently against the hallway wall and watched as the movers awkwardly lifted my beautiful mahogany piano onto their heavy, moving dollies. I watched them roll it slowly out of my front door, down the concrete steps, and up the metal ramp into the dark, empty belly of the commercial moving truck. Estelle walked out right behind them, looking incredibly satisfied with herself, like a queen who had just conquered a tiny village. Jada gave me one final look of pure, utter disdain before turning on her designer heels and walking back to her husband's sleek black car. They drove away down the street, leaving deep, muddy tire tracks across my front lawn and a gaping, empty space in my living room. I did not cry a single tear as I watched the moving truck completely disappear around the corner of my quiet suburban street. I simply walked back inside my empty living room and closed the heavy front door, locking the deadbolt firmly into place. The house was entirely silent again. I walked straight back down the hallway to my home office, stepping over the scattered financial documents on the floor, and picked up my cell phone from the large oak desk. I dialed a highly classified 10-digit number I had saved secretly in my contacts for over 5 years. The secure line rang exactly twice before a deep, professional, and highly alert voice answered. "Agent Thomas," the voice said clearly over the secure connection. I took a very deep breath, feeling the cold, absolute certainty settle deep into my bones like heavy iron. "Agent Thomas," I said, my voice perfectly steady, calm, and completely ready for war. "It is Clarice. I found exactly where the missing $2 million from the logistics company went. And yes, interstate wire fraud is heavily involved." The morning air in downtown Boston was bitterly cold, but I felt nothing but absolute burning purpose as I walked through the heavy revolving glass doors of the massive national bank. I was dressed in my sharpest charcoal gray business suit, holding my heavy leather briefcase tight against my side. For decades, I had managed the massive corporate accounts for the logistics company Marcus and I built together. I was the chief financial officer. Marcus was the face of the operation, the man shaking hands on the golf course, but I was the absolute foundation. And in his arrogant haste to secretly funnel millions of dollars into his hidden trust fund for his spoiled daughter, he made one incredibly massive legal oversight. He never removed my name as the primary co-signer and controlling officer on the master corporate accounts. He probably thought I would be too blinded by grief to ever look at the banking structure. He thought wrong. I bypassed the long lines at the teller windows and walked directly to the mahogany desk of the senior branch manager. Mr. Caldwell was a balding, middle-aged white man who had known me for 15 years. He stood up quickly when he saw me approaching, offering a polite, practiced smile of corporate sympathy. "Clarice," he said smoothly, extending his hand, "please accept my deepest condolences on the passing of your husband." Marcus was a visionary in the local business community. I did not shake his hand. I simply placed my heavy leather briefcase on his pristine desk and sat down in the leather chair opposite him. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any real emotion. "I am not here to discuss my grief today. I am here to execute a massive structural change to our corporate operating accounts." Mr. Caldwell looked slightly confused, but he quickly sat down and pulled his keyboard closer. "Of course, Clarice," he said, tapping a few keys. "What can I do for you today?" I pulled a thick stack of printed financial ledgers from my briefcase and pushed them across the desk. "I want you to immediately freeze every single corporate account associated with the logistics company," I stated firmly. "Every checking account, every savings reserve, and every single corporate credit card currently in active circulation. I am initiating a total unilateral financial lockdown effective this exact second." Mr. Caldwell stopped typing and stared at me with wide, shocked eyes. "Clarice, freezing the entire corporate structure is a massive step," he warned nervously. "You have dozens of active vendor accounts and payroll cycles. This will completely halt all operational cash flow." I stared directly into his eyes, my expression as hard as solid granite. "I am fully aware of the consequences, Mr. Caldwell. As the Chief Financial Officer and primary legal co-signer, I have the unilateral legal authority to freeze all assets pending a full internal forensic audit. There has been massive unauthorized financial bleeding, and I am applying the tourniquet right now." He swallowed hard, completely intimidated by my absolute authority. He typed quickly into his system, pulling up the active cardholder profiles. He read the names aloud, confirming the exact cards I was targeting. "I see a platinum corporate card issued to a Jada Brooks with an unlimited daily spending ceiling," he read nervously, "and a massive recurring weekly vendor payment to a consulting firm owned by a Preston Brooks." "Cancel them," I commanded without a single second of hesitation. "Cut off the phantom consulting fees completely. Deactivate Jada's limitless credit card immediately. Starve the absolute life out of them. Mr. Caldwell did exactly as he was told. The sound of his keyboard clicking in the quiet office felt like a beautiful symphony of pure financial justice. With a few simple keystrokes, the massive pipeline of stolen wealth feeding Preston and Jada was completely shut off. The veins were completely frozen. I left the bank feeling lighter than I had in several long, exhausted weeks. I stopped at a small upscale cafe down the street and ordered a black coffee. I sat at a small corner table watching the busy city streets through the glass window. I knew exactly what was going to happen next. It was simply a matter of watching the clock and waiting for the absolute inevitable explosion. It took exactly 45 minutes. My cell phone began to vibrate violently across the small cafe table. The caller identification displayed Jada's name in bright, flashing letters. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my hot coffee, letting the phone ring 3 full times before I calmly slid my finger across the screen to answer. "Hello, Jada," I said, my voice completely smooth and unbothered. "Mom, what did you just do?" she screamed into the phone. Her voice was incredibly high-pitched and completely hysterical, echoing loudly through the small speaker. I pulled the phone slightly away from my ear. "I am having a lovely cup of morning coffee, Jada. What are you doing?" "I am standing at the checkout counter inside a luxury boutique in the city center," she yelled, the sheer panic in her voice bringing me immense satisfaction. "I just tried to purchase a custom designer handbag, and my corporate card was completely declined. The cashier tried running it 3 different times, Mom." The machine said the account was entirely frozen. "People are staring at me, Mom. My friends are standing right here, watching me get humiliated. Turn the card back on, right this exact second." The image of my deeply arrogant, entitled daughter standing in a high-end luxury store, getting her credit card loudly declined in front of her wealthy, shallow friends was absolutely priceless. She had spent her entire adult life parading around like royalty, using my hard-earned money to buy her fake social status. The reality check was long overdue. I took another slow sip of my coffee. "I cannot do that, Jada," I replied calmly. "Why not?" she demanded, her voice breaking slightly. "Daddy gave me that card. It is my money. You have absolutely no right to touch my money." "Actually, Jada, I have every legal right," I explained, my tone completely devoid of any maternal warmth. "That card is tied directly to the corporate operating account of my logistics company. Since you do not work for the company and you provide absolutely no tangible value to the daily operations, you are legally committing corporate theft every time you buy a designer purse. I simply close the massive hole in my budget." "You are a bitter, jealous old woman," Jada screamed, losing complete control of her temper. "You are just angry because Daddy loved me more than he loved you. Wait until Preston finds out about this. He is going to completely destroy you in court. He is a powerful businessman and you are just a sad, lonely widow." I smiled a cold, sharp smile. "Tell your highly successful husband that his fake weekly consulting fees have also been completely permanently terminated," I said. "If he wants to earn a paycheck, he can go fill out a job application at the local grocery store like everyone else. Have a beautiful day shopping, Jada." I ended the call before she could scream another insult. I placed the phone face down on the table, feeling a deep, profound sense of absolute control. The power dynamic had completely fundamentally shifted. They thought they held all the winning cards because they possessed the physical house. But a massive mansion is completely useless if you cannot afford to pay the expensive monthly utility bills or buy the expensive food to put in the custom refrigerator. I had just cut off their oxygen supply, and I knew they were going to start heavily panicking very soon. I finished my coffee in absolute peace and walked back to my car. The drive back to the quiet suburbs gave me plenty of time to mentally prepare for the next calculated step in my massive legal war. I turned onto my familiar tree-lined street, feeling incredibly focused. But as I slowly pulled my car into my concrete driveway, the deep sense of satisfaction instantly evaporated completely, replaced by a cold, sharp rush of dangerous adrenaline. My heavy wooden front door was violently kicked wide open. The thick door frame was completely splintered with jagged pieces of white-painted wood scattered violently across the concrete porch. The heavy metal deadbolt lock was entirely destroyed, hanging uselessly from the broken hinges. I did not panic. I did not scream or run away. I reached into the heavy center console of my car and pulled out the heavy, solid steel flashlight I always kept for sudden emergencies. I gripped it tightly in my right hand and walked slowly and deliberately up the concrete steps. I pushed the broken door open, stepping carefully over the shattered wood. The house was completely dark and entirely silent. I walked slowly down the main hallway toward the living room, my heart beating steadily in my chest. Sitting completely still in the dark shadows on my living room sofa was Preston. His expensive tailored suit jacket was thrown carelessly on the floor. His expensive silk tie was violently ripped completely open. He was leaning heavily forward, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at me with wild, bloodshot eyes. He did not look like the arrogant, wealthy finance bro who had threatened me just yesterday. He looked like a deeply desperate, completely cornered animal. He stood up slowly, his large physical frame blocking the dim light coming from the window. His hands were shaking violently by his sides, forming tight, angry fists that seemed ready to strike out at any given moment. I tightened my secure grip on the heavy steel flashlight, perfectly prepared to violently defend myself if he decided to take another aggressive step forward. The absolute silence in the broken house was incredibly heavy, thick, and practically suffocating for both of us. The dangerous, aggressive energy rolling off his body was absolutely undeniable. "You need to unfreeze those accounts right now, Clarice," he growled, his voice trembling with a dark, terrifying edge. "You have absolutely no idea who I owe money to." The cold wind blew through the shattered frame of my front door, carrying the bitter chill of the outside air directly into my dark living room. I stood perfectly still on the carpet with the heavy steel flashlight gripped tightly in my right hand. Preston sat on my sofa, looking completely unrecognizable from the arrogant man who had stood in the $5 million Marthas Vineyard mansion just 24 hours ago, telling me I had absolutely nothing. His expensive tailored suit jacket was crumpled on the floor like a piece of worthless trash. His hair was disheveled, and his pale face was slick with a heavy layer of nervous sweat. He stared at me with wide, frantic eyes, breathing heavily through his mouth, like a man who had just run a marathon and realized he was entirely lost in the woods. "You need to unfreeze those accounts right now, Clarice," he growled again, his voice vibrating with a dark, terrifying edge. "You have absolutely no idea who I owe money to." I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward toward the broken door. I just looked at him with absolute clinical detachment, analyzing his complete physical and psychological breakdown. "I thought you were a highly successful finance executive, Preston," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and completely devoid of any sympathy. "I thought you were a brilliant visionary building massive tech ventures. Why would a wealthy man be so incredibly desperate over a single frozen corporate credit card and a halted consulting fee? Surely you have millions of your own personal funds to fall back on." Preston let out a harsh, bitter sound that was halfway between a dry laugh and a painful sob. He reached up with trembling hands and pulled violently at his expensive silk tie, loosening it further around his red neck. "There is no personal money, Clarice," he spat, his pale eyes darting nervously around the dark room, as if he expected someone to jump out of the shadows and grab him. "There never was any personal money. My tech ventures completely failed 3 years ago. The investors pulled out, the market shifted, and I was left holding millions of dollars in highly leveraged debt. I owed money to people who do not use traditional collection agencies. I owed money to people who send men to your house to break your legs." I kept my face completely blank, but internally my certified public accountant brain was rapidly processing this new, massive piece of information. "So you used my husband," I stated flatly. "You manipulated Marcus into giving you a fake consulting salary to pay off your dangerous private lenders." "It was not just the salary," Preston admitted, his voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper. "The salary was barely enough to cover the monthly interest on the massive loans. I needed real capital, Clarice. I needed a massive, continuous stream of untraceable digital assets to pay them back and keep them completely off my back. That is why I made Marcus buy the Marthas Vineyard property. It was never just a vacation house for Jada. It was a completely isolated, secure location with massive square footage and absolutely no nosy neighbors." He leaned forward, resting his head in his shaking hands. I retrofitted the entire basement of the Villa Clarice. I completely soundproofed the walls, installed massive industrial-grade air conditioning units, and filled the entire lower level of the house with high-powered commercial computer servers, hundreds of them running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I built one of the largest private, unauthorized cryptocurrency mining farms on the entire East Coast, directly underneath your daughter's feet, and she was entirely too stupid to even notice the vibrating floors. The sheer audacity of his confession hung heavily in the cold air of my living room. I stared at him, picturing the beautiful imported marble floors of the beachfront mansion and the massive illegal digital operation humming violently right beneath them. But cryptocurrency mining requires massive amounts of commercial electricity. I said, my mind quickly jumping to the basic operational logistics. The power bill for a server farm of that size would easily be tens of thousands of dollars every single month. How did you possibly pay for the electricity without completely draining the shell company accounts and tipping off the utility providers? Preston looked up at me, a sick, twisted look of lingering pride flashing briefly across his sweaty face. I routed the power meters, Clarice, he explained. I hired a private contractor to completely bypass the standard residential utility grid on the island. We tapped the massive lines, and then I disguised the digital billing routing, the massive monthly electricity costs, directly to the commercial warehouse utility accounts of your logistics company. I buried the invoices deep inside the operational expenses of your shipping hubs. Marcus signed off on them without ever looking twice. He just thought the warehouse refrigeration units were running inefficiently. For a long moment, the room was completely silent. I processed every single word he had just said. I thought about the hours I had spent agonizing over those inflated commercial utility bills, trying desperately to negotiate better rates with the power companies to save our logistics business from bleeding cash. I thought about the stress it had caused me while Preston was sitting in a luxury beach house, generating illegal digital currency on my dime. And then, something entirely unexpected happened. I felt a strange bubbling sensation rising rapidly in my chest. It pushed its way up my throat and past my lips. I started to laugh. It was not a hysterical laugh or a warm, genuine chuckle. It was a cold, deep, mocking laugh that echoed loudly against the walls of the broken house. I laughed at the sheer, unadulterated stupidity of the entitled white man sitting on my sofa. I laughed at the absolute arrogance it took to execute such a highly flawed, completely unsustainable financial crime and actually believe he was a genius. Preston completely froze. His sweaty face twisted into an expression of absolute furious confusion. "What is so funny?" he demanded, his voice cracking with sudden explosive anger. "What the hell are you laughing at, Clarice?" "I am laughing at you, Preston," I said, shaking my head slowly. "You thought you were a brilliant criminal mastermind. You thought you were pulling off the perfect massive financial heist right under my nose. But you are just a desperate amateur who built a house of cards on a massive ticking time bomb. You stole millions of dollars to generate fake internet money, and you left a paper trail so wide and so incredibly obvious that a first-year accounting student could have found it blindfolded." The mockery in my voice completely shattered the last remaining pieces of his fragile ego. Preston jumped aggressively off the sofa, his large physical frame completely tense and vibrating with violent rage. He took a heavy step toward me, completely forgetting about the heavy steel flashlight in my hand. He pointed a shaking, angry finger directly at my face. "You think you have won!" he shouted, spit flying from his lips. "You think you can just freeze the accounts, laugh in my face, and walk away with your pristine little life? If I go down, Clarice, I am taking everything with me. I will drag Marcus and his precious logistics company straight through the deepest mud I can find." He began pacing wildly across the living room carpet, acting like a cornered, desperate predator. "I will go directly to the national media, Clarice. I will go to every single major investor, every commercial client, and every vendor you have. I will tell them that Marcus was fully complicit in a massive corporate money laundering scheme. I will tell them the logistics company was nothing but a dirty financial front to fund illegal offshore cryptocurrency operations. I will completely destroy the corporate reputation you spent 35 years building. By the time I am finished running my mouth, your company will be completely bankrupt, your accounts will be seized, and you will be left standing in the street with absolutely nothing. You either unfreeze those accounts right now and give me the money to pay off my lenders, or I burn your entire empire to the ground today." His threat was designed to completely terrify me. It was designed to leverage my absolute dedication to my professional life and my company against his own desperate need for survival. He wanted mutual destruction. He wanted me to believe that protecting my business was worth saving his miserable life. I looked at him pacing and panting in my living room. I slowly lowered the heavy steel flashlight, placing it calmly on the small wooden table near the broken doorway. I did not need a physical weapon to completely destroy Preston. I had something infinitely more powerful. I walked over to the leather briefcase I had dropped on the floor when I found the door broken. I calmly popped the metal latches and reached inside. I pulled out a thick manila folder filled with the dense printed financial documents and forensic reports I had compiled earlier that afternoon. I walked slowly toward the center of the room and tossed the heavy folder casually onto the glass coffee table right in front of him. Preston stopped pacing. He stared down at the plain manila folder as if it were a live explosive device. "What is that?" he asked, his voice suddenly dropping back down to a nervous, terrified whisper. I crossed my arms tightly over my chest and looked at him with absolute cold, calculating victory. "That is the complete end of your miserable, arrogant life, Preston," I said, my voice perfectly steady and utterly merciless. "You cannot burn my empire to the ground because I already took out the trash. I already filed the comprehensive suspicious activity reports with the Federal Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The federal government already knows exactly about the missing money and the illegal digital transfers." Preston's face drained of all remaining color, turning a sickly pale gray in the dim light. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound coming out. "But I suggest you look very carefully at page 3. Preston, I continued, my tone dropping to a sharp, deadly whisper. "Because you made one incredibly massive, arrogant mistake when you built your little secret operation. You were so absolutely eager to claim total ownership of the illegal profits that you did not put the digital servers under my husband's name. The servers, the hardware receipts, and the digital wallet registrations are not in Marcus' name. They are exclusively in yours." Preston slowly reached down with violently shaking hands and opened the manila folder. His eyes scanned the highlighted documents, the undeniable forensic proof of his own absolute stupidity. "And that contractor you hired to bypass the electrical meters," I added, taking one final step closer to him so he could hear the absolute finality in my voice. He did not just tap into the local residential power lines on the island. He tapped directly into the restricted high-voltage lines supporting the municipal infrastructure. The electricity you have been stealing for 3 years was not just stolen from my company. It was stolen from the federal grid. I watched the absolute terror completely consume him as the reality of his situation set in. "I already filed the suspicious activity reports, but look at page 3, Preston. The servers aren't in Marcus's name, they're in yours, and the electricity was stolen from the federal grid." The days following my confrontation with Preston were eerily quiet. I knew it was only the calm before a massive storm. The desperate silence told me that Preston was running entirely out of options and running straight to my mother-in-law for cover. Sure enough, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, I received a brief demanding message from Estelle, telling me to come to her historic brick house in the wealthy district immediately. She framed it as a necessary family gathering to discuss the logistics of Marcus' remaining estate. I knew exactly what it really was. It was a coordinated ambush. I dressed carefully, choosing a sharp navy blue tailored suit. I wanted to look like the chief financial officer I was, not the grieving, broken widow they so desperately wanted me to be. When I arrived at Estelle's sprawling property, the circular driveway was completely packed with luxury vehicles. I recognized the expensive cars belonging to Marcus' older brother, Uncle Lawrence, and his snooty wife, Aunt Beatrice. There were cars belonging to cousins and extended relatives who only ever showed up when there was money or drama on the table. I walked up the wide stone steps and pushed open the heavy front door. The entire family was gathered in Estelle's formal living room, sitting in a large, intimidating circle of antique armchairs and velvet sofas. Jada sat perfectly in the center, holding a crumpled tissue to her dry eyes, playing the absolute victim. Preston stood right behind her, resting his hands protectively on her shoulders, playing the role of the devoted, supportive husband. Estelle sat at the head of the room like a reigning monarch holding court over her loyal subjects. When I walked into the room, every single conversation stopped immediately. Dozens of highly judgmental eyes turned to stare at me. Nobody offered me a seat. Nobody offered a single word of comfort for the recent loss of my husband. Estelle simply pointed a long, bony finger toward the center of the room, commanding me to stand right there like a criminal on trial. "We are here to talk about your completely erratic and destructive behavior, Clarice," she announced, her loud, shrill voice echoing off the high ceiling. Lawrence cleared his throat and leaned forward in his chair. "We are all deeply worried about your mental state, Clarice," he said, using a fake tone of deep brotherly concern. "Grief does terrible things to the human mind, but you are taking your pain out on your own daughter. We heard what you did at the bank. Freezing the corporate accounts and leaving Jada completely stranded without access to her own inheritance is completely unacceptable." Aunt Beatrice chimed in, nodding her head vigorously. "You are acting out of pure spite, Clarice," she added. "Just because Marcus passed away does not give you the right to try and completely ruin Jada's beautiful marriage. Preston is a good man trying to hold his family together, and you are treating him like a common thief. You need to release those funds and step away from the business before you embarrass this family any further." I stood perfectly still in the center of the hostile room, letting their coordinated attacks wash entirely over me. Every single person in that room had happily enjoyed the financial benefits of the logistics company over the past 3 decades. Whenever a cousin needed tuition money or an uncle needed a massive loan to start a failing business, Marcus was the first person they called. And I was the one who quietly approved the transfers, keeping their chaotic lives completely afloat. Yet here they were, eagerly sharpening their knives to cut me entirely out of the picture. They were parasites feeding off my hard work and using my husband's recent death as an excuse to finally discard me. The sheer ungratefulness was staggering, but it only fueled my intense focus. They were completely dedicated to gaslighting me into submission. They wanted me to believe that my financial boundaries were actually signs of severe mental illness. Jada sniffled loudly, wiping a fake tear from her cheek. "I just want my mother back," she lied, her voice trembling with manufactured sadness. "I want the mother who loved me, not this cold, bitter woman who wants to see me lose my beautiful home." Preston squeezed her shoulders, looking at the family with a tragic expression. "We are just trying to survive this tragedy," he whispered softly, completely masking the violent, desperate man who had threatened me in the dark just days ago. Estelle stood up from her chair, her expensive jewelry clinking loudly. She walked slowly toward me, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "This has absolutely nothing to do with grief," she declared, loudly pointing her finger directly at my face. "This is exactly who you have always been, Clarice. You have always been a bitter, jealous woman from the absolute bottom of the social barrel." The entire room went completely silent as Estelle finally dropped the fake concern and let her true venom spill out. "I always hated that Marcus married you." She spat, her eyes wide with rage. "You came from absolutely nothing. You grew up in a tiny, cheap apartment with dirty clothes and no social standing whatsoever. You never fit into our high society image, and you dragged my son down with your cheap, frugal mentality. You made him live like a peasant just so you could feel completely in control of his life." I did not interrupt her. I let her dig her own massive grave right in front of the entire family. Estelle paced back and forth, completely losing herself in her hateful rant. "I had to push Marcus every single day to spoil Jada," she confessed proudly, her voice rising higher and higher. "I had to make sure he gave her the luxury and the absolute privilege she deserved, because I knew you would try to raise her with your disgusting working-class poverty mindset. I told Marcus to buy her everything she ever wanted to completely compensate for having a mother like you. I knew about the Marthas Vineyard house from the very beginning. I helped him hide it from you because I knew you would selfishly try to take it away. You do not belong in that beautiful house, Clarice, and you do not belong in this family. Now you are going to call the bank and unfreeze every single account, or we are going to hire a team of lawyers to have you legally declared mentally incompetent and completely unfit to manage the corporate estate. We will lock you away in a facility and take every single penny you have left." Her massive threat hung heavily in the air. The aunts and uncles nodded in total agreement, entirely willing to help lock a sane, healthy woman in a psychiatric facility just to secure their access to the family wealth. Jada looked at me with a cold, calculating smirk, completely dropping the crying victim act for just a second. Preston stood tall, looking incredibly proud of the massive trap he had helped orchestrate. They thought they had me completely surrounded. They thought the sheer weight of family pressure would crush my spirit and force me to surrender the logistics company accounts. They truly believed that if they all shouted loud enough, I would simply surrender my logic and accept their completely fabricated version of reality. But they fundamentally misunderstood exactly who they were dealing with. I am not a fragile woman who breaks under social pressure. I am a forensic auditor who destroys liars for a living. I looked slowly around the large room, making direct eye contact with every single person who had just threatened my freedom and my sanity. I looked at Lawrence and Beatrice. I looked at Jada and Preston. And finally, I looked directly at Estelle. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I reached into my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my cell phone. "This is a very beautiful smart television you have, Estelle," I said, pointing to the massive flat screen mounted proudly on the wall above the grand fireplace. "Before I make any decisions about the corporate accounts, I think it is only fair that you all hear exactly what Marcus thought about his precious son-in-law during his final days on Earth." I tapped the screen of my phone. I had already linked my device directly to her home wireless network when I parked my car in the driveway. I selected a hidden audio file I had uncovered deep inside Marcus' private secure business servers just 2 nights ago. It was a digital recording of a heated phone call automatically saved by the corporate telecom system. I pressed play. The massive speakers of Estelle's expensive home theater system roared to life. The audio was incredibly crisp and crystal clear, filling the entire living room. It was Marcus' voice, sounding incredibly tired, completely terrified and aggressively angry. "You are bankrupting me, Preston!" My dead husband's voice screamed through the high-quality speakers. The sound of his voice made Jada physically jump in her chair. "You told me the server farm would generate massive profits," Marcus yelled on the recording. "You told me it was a completely safe investment. Now the company is bleeding cash and the utility bills are astronomical. I cannot cover your illicit debts anymore, Preston. The people you owe money to are calling my private office line. They are threatening my life. I am completely done covering for your massive failures." Preston. Voice echoed through the room, next sounding desperate and completely panicked. "Marcus, please, you cannot cut me off. They will kill me. Just give me 1 more month to mine the digital currency." Marcus' voice cut him off with absolute brutal finality. "No more money, Preston. I am shutting the entire operation down. I am going to tell Clarice everything. She is the only one who knows how to fix this financial mess. I am telling my wife the absolute truth tomorrow morning." I paused the recording. The living room went completely dead silent. The silence was so heavy and absolute you could hear the rain hitting the glass windows. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved a single muscle. The reality of the situation washed over the entire room like a freezing tidal wave. Preston was not a successful businessman. He was a reckless criminal who had destroyed Marcus' legacy and brought a deadly threat to our entire family. The massive beach house in Marthas Vineyard was not a loving gift to a precious daughter. It was an illegal criminal enterprise built on stolen funds and massive lies. Lawrence and Beatrice stared at Preston with wide, terrified eyes, finally realizing they had just defended a man who had brought dangerous criminals directly to their family doorstep. Estelle stood frozen, her mouth hanging wide open, the arrogant hatred completely drained from her pale, wrinkled face. Jada turned her head very slowly to look up at her husband, her eyes filled with absolute shock and dawning horror. I looked at the faces of my extended relatives. The righteous indignation they had proudly displayed just 10 minutes ago was entirely, completely gone. They looked down at the expensive rugs, completely ashamed and terrified of the legal storm that was rapidly approaching. Preston was completely, entirely trapped. There were no more lies to tell. There were no more gaslighting tactics left to use. I stood tall in the center of the silent room, feeling the absolute power of the truth completely crush their massive illusion. "You wanted a family intervention," I said, my voice perfectly calm and utterly devastating. "Now you have one." The drive home from Estelle's house was the first time in weeks that I actually allowed myself to breathe properly. I had dropped an absolute bomb on their perfect upper-class illusion and exposed Preston for the desperate criminal he truly was. I knew they were currently panicking, trying to figure out how to handle the massive legal mess he had created. But I also knew that cornered rats bite the hardest when they have absolutely nowhere left to run. Preston was entirely out of options, and his illegal creditors were breathing heavily down his neck. He needed me to unfreeze those corporate accounts immediately, and he was willing to use the most vicious weapons available to force my hand. I just did not realize that my own daughter would willingly hand him the ultimate weapon to use against me. The next morning, the heavy rain had finally stopped, leaving the suburban streets looking washed and gray. I was sitting at my kitchen table, drinking a hot cup of black coffee and reviewing the forensic accounting files when a loud, sharp knock echoed from my front door. I walked down the hallway and looked through the clear side window. A tall man wearing a cheap beige windbreaker and holding a thick manila envelope was standing on my porch. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. "Are you Clarice?" he asked, his voice completely flat and professional. "I am," I replied, my eyes fixed entirely on the thick envelope in his hands. "You have been officially served," he said, thrusting the envelope toward my chest. He turned around instantly and walked quickly down the driveway, getting into a plain silver sedan and driving away without looking back a single time. I stood in the open doorway, the cold morning air blowing against my face, and slowly opened the heavy metal clasp of the envelope. I pulled out a thick stack of official legal documents stamped with the bold blue seal of the state family court. I read the bold black letters printed across the very top page: Emergency Order of Protection and Restraining Order. The primary petitioner listed was my daughter Jada. The primary respondent was me. I closed the front door and walked slowly back to the kitchen table, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm in my chest. I sat down and forced myself to read every single line of the sickening legal document. Jada had completely fabricated a terrifying, completely unhinged narrative. She claimed under penalty of perjury that I had suffered a massive psychotic break following the sudden death of my husband. She claimed I was violently freezing financial accounts out of pure malicious spite and threatening her husband with a deadly steel weapon. She completely twisted the narrative of Preston breaking into my home, turning it into a story where I had lured him there to violently attack him. But the absolute worst part, the part that felt like a physical knife twisting deeply into my stomach, was the section regarding my grandchildren. Jada requested and the family court judge temporarily granted a complete physical and legal barrier between me and her 2 young children. I was legally barred from coming within 500 feet of 7-year-old Maya and 4-year-old Leo. I was forbidden from calling them, sending them physical mail, or contacting their elementary school. Jada had effectively taken my precious grandchildren completely hostage. The paperwork clearly stated that the restraining order would only be lifted if I agreed to undergo a comprehensive psychological evaluation and release the frozen financial assets to prove I was acting in good faith. It was a blatant, violent extortion tactic wrapped neatly in official judicial paperwork. For the first time since Marcus died, the immense, crushing weight of the betrayal finally broke through my carefully constructed professional armor. The clinical detachment I had used to survive the past few weeks completely vanished. I looked at the legal documents on my kitchen table and my vision instantly blurred. The tears came fast and heavy, burning my eyes and spilling hotly down my cheeks. I did not just lose my husband to a sudden brain aneurysm. I had lost the entire foundational truth of my 35-year marriage. I had lost the daughter I had stayed awake nights nursing through terrible fevers, the daughter I had worked 80-hour weeks to put through expensive private schools. And now I was losing the only pure, innocent joy left in my entire life. I thought about Maya's bright, beautiful smile when we baked sugar cookies together in this very kitchen. I thought about little Leo's infectious belly laugh when I read him stories on the living room rug. They were my absolute world, and Jada was using their innocent lives as a cheap bargaining chip to fund her husband's illegal criminal enterprise. I slid out of my kitchen chair and sank slowly onto the cold, hard linoleum floor. I pulled my knees tightly into my chest and wept. I sobbed until my throat was completely raw and my lungs physically ached. I cried for the death of my marriage. I cried for the deep, profound failure of my motherhood. I cried for the absolute cruelty of a world that allowed arrogant, greedy people to completely destroy the lives of those who loved them the most. I stayed on the floor for a very long time, letting the intense, agonizing grief completely wash over me, breaking me down into a million tiny, shattered pieces. But I am Clarice. I do not stay broken on the floor. Eventually, the hot tears stopped falling. The heavy, agonizing sobs slowly turned into deep, steady breaths. The immense pain in my chest did not disappear, but it fundamentally transformed. The crushing grief hardened, slowly compressing under massive pressure until it became a diamond of pure, cold, calculating rage. Jada had played her absolute trump card. She thought taking my grandchildren away would completely shatter my spirit and force me to surrender the logistics company accounts. She thought I would beg for her mercy. She was entirely wrong. I placed both my hands flat on the cold kitchen floor and pushed myself up. I walked directly to the downstairs bathroom and turned on the cold water faucet. I splashed the freezing water on my swollen face, washing away the physical evidence of my temporary weakness. I looked at my reflection in the bright mirror. My eyes were completely red and bloodshot, but they were entirely focused. Grief is a temporary luxury for people who have nothing left to fight for. Rage is a highly effective tool for people who are about to go to absolute war. I walked back to my home office and sat down at my large oak desk. I completely ignored the emotional restraining order sitting on my kitchen table and focused entirely on the massive financial puzzle in front of me. I knew Jada did not come up with this vicious legal strategy completely on her own. She was far too shallow and entirely too lazy to navigate the family court system with such rapid, aggressive precision. This had Preston written all over it. He was pulling the strings, manipulating his spoiled wife into doing his dirty work while he hid safely behind her tears. I opened my sleek silver laptop and fired up my proprietary forensic accounting software once again. If Preston was a criminal who happily stole commercial electricity from the federal grid and ran illegal cryptocurrency mining farms out of his basement, he was absolutely not the kind of man who would leave a $5 million physical asset sitting cleanly in his wife's name. Thieves do not trust anyone, not even the people they sleep next to every single night. I decided to take a much deeper microscopic look at the actual corporate structure of Ocean View Holdings Limited Liability Company. I bypassed the initial formation documents that Preston had so proudly slammed on the Marble Island a few days ago. Those documents were 5 years old. They represented the initial legal trap Marcus had built, but corporate structures are highly fluid entities. They can be amended, restructured, and quietly, completely manipulated. I logged directly into the state corporate registry database using my advanced professional credentials. I pulled the complete historical filing record for the shell company, searching specifically for any legal amendments filed after the original date of purchase. The system loaded for several long, tense seconds before a new list of official documents populated on my bright screen. My eyes immediately locked onto a highly specific filing dated exactly 2 years ago. It was an official amendment to the corporate operating agreement. I downloaded the heavy encrypted file and opened it on my screen. I read through the dense, complicated legal jargon, my accounting brain quickly translating the complex corporate maneuvers into plain, staggering reality. When Marcus originally formed the holding company, he designated Jada as the absolute sole managing member, giving her 100% equity ownership of the massive beachfront property. But 2 years ago, Preston had completely convinced Jada to sign a legal amendment authorizing the creation and issuance of entirely new corporate voting units. The document clearly showed that Jada had unknowingly authorized the massive dilution of her own equity. The newly minted corporate shares were immediately transferred directly into a completely different shadow corporation. I quickly ran a secondary search on the new shadow corporation. It was a blind trust, completely controlled entirely and exclusively by Preston. I sat back in my heavy leather office chair, completely stunned by the sheer absolute magnitude of the betrayal. Jada had completely sold her soul to destroy me over a house she did not even own anymore. Preston had successfully executed a classic corporate takeover right under her nose. By issuing the new shares and absorbing them into his private trust, he had diluted Jada's original ownership stake from 100% down to a miserable microscopic 15%. Preston owned the $5 million beachfront villa. He owned the holding company. He owned absolutely everything. Jada was nothing but a highly convenient, ignorant pawn being completely played by her own husband. She was currently burning her entire family to the absolute ground, legally kidnapping my grandchildren and destroying her mother's life to fiercely protect a massive fortune that Preston had already quietly stolen from her. A slow, chilling smile spread completely across my face in the quiet darkness of my home office. The restraining order was a deeply painful wound, yes, but it was also the final, absolute validation I needed to completely destroy them without a single ounce of lingering guilt. Jada had proudly declared absolute war, using her own children as heavily armed hostages, but she was standing proudly on a massive wooden bridge that her husband had already covered completely in highly flammable gasoline. All I had to do now was light the match. I waited exactly 3 days before I made my next calculated move. Silence is a highly effective weapon, but a perfectly timed surrender is an absolute masterpiece of psychological warfare. I knew Jada was sitting in that massive $5 million house, feeling incredibly victorious. She thought the restraining order had completely broken me down. She thought I was sitting alone in my dark suburban home, weeping bitterly over the loss of my precious grandchildren and desperately trying to figure out how to hand over the logistics company accounts. I needed her to keep believing that massive, ridiculous lie. I needed her ego to be so incredibly inflated that she would never see the absolute devastation coming right for her neck. I picked up my cell phone and typed a very short, simple text message to my daughter. I told her I was completely exhausted. I told her I could not fight her or Preston anymore, and that I wanted to meet her at a neutral public location to discuss a financial peace offering strictly for the sake of the children. She eagerly agreed to meet me at a high-end organic coffee shop downtown. She deliberately chose a place that was incredibly expensive and highly visible because she wanted to make sure I felt entirely out of place and deeply uncomfortable. When I walked into the crowded, bustling cafe, Jada was already sitting at a small corner table near the large front window. She looked absolutely radiant, wearing a light beige designer trench coat and holding a massive, expensive leather handbag on her lap. She was sipping a green matcha latte and scrolling carelessly on her phone, acting exactly like a wealthy socialite who had not just legally kidnapped her own mother's innocent grandchildren. I walked slowly over to the small wooden table and sat down heavily across from her. I did not wear my sharp, tailored business suits today. I intentionally wore an oversized gray cashmere sweater and left my hair completely unstyled and flat. I let my shoulders slump forward, projecting the exact perfect image of a defeated, broken older woman who had completely given up on life. Jada looked up from her glowing phone screen, and a wide, arrogant smile spread completely across her face. She loved seeing me look so tired and old. She loved the totally fabricated power dynamic she thought she had successfully established. "Hello, Mom," she said, her voice dripping with incredibly fake, sweet sympathy. "I am really glad you finally decided to be reasonable and mature about all of this. Preston and I were just talking this morning about how terribly sad it is that you are actively choosing money over your own flesh and blood family." I kept my eyes focused firmly on the wooden table, playing the role of the incredibly guilty mother perfectly. "You know I deeply love Maya and Leo," I said, my voice soft and intentionally trembling with manufactured emotion. "I cannot stand the thought of being legally separated from them, Jada. They are my absolute entire world, and my heart is completely broken." Jada took a slow, arrogant sip of her expensive green drink. Well, mom actions have serious legal consequences. She lectured me like I was a misbehaving child who needed a firm scolding. You cannot just march into a bank and freeze our corporate operating accounts and then expect us to let you around our small children. You have been acting completely unhinged lately, and Preston feels you are a serious physical and emotional danger to our family peace. The mere mention of Preston's name made my blood boil hot in my veins, but I kept my face entirely blank and neutral. I reached carefully into my worn leather purse and slowly pulled out a crisp, white envelope. I slid it gently across the smooth table directly toward her manicured hands. "I want to make things right, Jada," I whispered softly. "I know the corporate accounts are completely frozen right now while the legal teams sort out your father's massive complex estate. I know you and Preston might be struggling heavily with the daily maintenance expenses of that massive beachfront house. This is a certified cashier check for exactly $50,000. It is strictly from my own personal retirement savings account. It is exclusively for the kids. I want to make absolutely sure they are completely taken care of while we peacefully resolve this terrible, ugly situation." Jada stared at the pristine white envelope, her greedy eyes lighting up with absolute unmasked triumph. She snatched the envelope right off the table and quickly tore it open, pulling out the heavy official bank check. She stared down at the $50,000, and a loud, incredibly arrogant laugh escaped her glossed lips. She genuinely thought she had completely won the war. She thought she had successfully extorted her own mother and completely broken my stubborn spirit. "Thank you, Mom," she said proudly, slipping the heavy check deep into her designer handbag. "This is a very good first step toward real healing. If you completely unfreeze the main corporate accounts by Friday afternoon, Preston might actually convince the judge to entirely drop the restraining order against you." I nodded my head slowly, pretending to be incredibly grateful for her entirely manufactured mercy. I picked up my plain black coffee and took a slow, warm sip, looking her directly in her pale eyes. "I just want to make absolutely sure the money actually goes to my grandchildren, Jada," I said, my voice suddenly dropping its pathetic, trembling act and becoming perfectly smooth, cold, and casual. "Just make completely sure Preston does not quietly use that $50,000 for his private offshore accounts." The arrogant, victorious smile on Jada's face instantly vanished into thin air. She frowned deeply, looking at me with sudden, intense confusion. "What offshore accounts?" she asked, her voice incredibly tight and instantly defensive. "Preston does not have any hidden offshore accounts, Mom. He is a highly legitimate, transparent financial consultant." I placed my coffee cup gently back on the wooden table and tilted my head slightly, feigning complete, innocent surprise. "Oh," I murmured softly, acting as if I had just accidentally revealed a massive, devastating secret. "I am so sorry. I just logically assumed you knew absolutely everything about his recent financial restructuring, honey, especially since he completely changed the legal operating agreement for the beachfront house. Have you actually checked the limited liability company ownership papers lately, baby?" Jada's face completely drained of all healthy color, turning a sickly pale shade of white. She sat up perfectly straight, her shaking hands gripping the hard edge of the wooden table. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice rising slightly in the quiet, crowded cafe. "I legally own that house. Daddy left the entire holding company strictly to me in his final will. It is 100% mine." I sighed deeply, shaking my head with incredibly fake maternal pity. "You really should have your own independent lawyer take a very close look at the current equity distribution, Jada. Do not just take my word for it. Look at the corporate registry yourself." I stood up slowly from the table, grabbing my heavy purse. "Have a beautiful afternoon, Jada," I said, turning completely away and walking directly out of the cafe, leaving her sitting there entirely paralyzed by sudden, overwhelming paranoia. The tiny seed of absolute doubt was officially planted, and I knew exactly how incredibly fast it would grow in her highly insecure mind. That same night, the massive beachfront villa in Marthas Vineyard was completely dark and entirely silent. Preston had told Jada he was going to sleep alone in the downstairs guest bedroom because he had a massive pounding headache, but Jada could not sleep a single wink. The terrible chilling seed I had planted in the coffee shop was rapidly growing into a massive twisting vine of pure suffocating panic. She waited anxiously in the dark until the massive house was entirely quiet, and she slowly crept out of her luxurious master suite. She walked completely silently down the dark carpeted hallway and slipped quietly into Preston's private home office. She knew exactly where he kept his heavy steel floor safe, completely hidden behind the custom oak bookshelf. She also knew that Preston lazily used their wedding anniversary as the digital combination code because he entirely lacked basic imagination. She punched the numbers quickly into the glowing keypad, and the heavy metal door clicked loudly open. Jada reached her shaking hands inside, entirely bypassing the thick stacks of emergency cash and the expensive luxury watches. She pulled out a thick, heavy blue folder, completely expecting to find the corporate ownership documents I had specifically mentioned. But what she actually found was infinitely more terrifying than losing a house. She opened the heavy folder and stared at the crisp white legal papers inside. Her hands began to shake violently out of pure terror. They were officially drafted divorce papers prepared entirely by Preston's aggressive legal team. The papers completely stripped Jada of all marital assets and aggressively demanded full permanent physical custody of the children. And the most horrifying detail of all was the official date printed clearly at the very top of the front page. Preston had officially drafted the divorce papers the exact day after Marcus' funeral. Jada stood completely frozen in the center of the dark home office. Her bare feet felt like solid blocks of ice against the imported hardwood floor. Her hands were shaking violently as she stared down at the crisp white legal documents she had just pulled from the heavy steel safe. The date stamped clearly at the very top of the divorce petition burned a permanent, agonizing hole directly into her mind. It was the exact day after her father's funeral. While she was crying over a dark wooden casket, her husband was sitting in a lawyer office legally plotting to completely abandon her. She felt the heavy leather folder slip slowly from her trembling fingers. It crashed loudly onto the floor, scattering the terrifying papers across the expensive Persian rug. The loud, sudden noise echoed violently through the silent beachfront villa. Jada could not breathe. The walls of the massive $5 million house felt like they were rapidly closing in on her, entirely suffocating her. A few agonizing seconds later, the heavy wooden door of the office swung wide open. Preston stood in the doorway. He was wearing loose gray sweatpants and a white undershirt, rubbing his tired eyes, looking entirely annoyed that his sleep had been abruptly interrupted. He looked at Jada standing barefoot and completely terrified in her silk pajamas. Then he slowly looked down at the open safe and the divorce documents scattered chaotically across the floor. For a brief fleeting second, he looked slightly surprised that she had figured out his secret digital combination. But the surprise quickly completely melted away into a cold, hard expression of absolute, utter indifference. He did not rush forward to hold her. He did not desperately try to invent a clever, complicated lie to explain the papers away. He simply walked into the room, crossed his thick arms over his chest, and leaned casually against the edge of his massive wooden desk. "What is this?" Jada whispered, her voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate sob as she pointed a violently trembling finger at the floor. "You drafted official divorce papers the very day we buried my father. You were planning to leave me all alone." Preston let out a long, heavy sigh, acting exactly like a man who was entirely exhausted by a boring, dramatic television show. He slowly reached down, picked up the top page of the legal document, and placed it calmly on his desk. "I was not just planning to leave you, Jada," he said, his voice completely devoid of any human affection or warmth. "I am definitely leaving you, Lee. The only reason I have not officially filed the paperwork with the family court yet is because your stubborn mother completely froze the corporate accounts. I need the liquid cash from the logistics company to properly finalize my personal financial escape plan." Jada gasped loudly, taking a physical step backward, as the absolute sheer cruelty of his words hit her chest like a speeding freight train. "You cannot possibly do this to me," she cried, her voice rising into a loud, hysterical pitch. "This is my house, Preston. My father bought this beautiful house specifically for me. You have absolutely nothing without my family wealth. You are a complete fraud." Preston laughed. It was a harsh, bitter sound that completely filled the quiet room, making Jada physically cringe. "Your house," he mocked, stepping aggressively closer to her until she was forced to look up into his pale, cold eyes. "You really are exactly as incredibly stupid as your mother always said you were. You do not own this house, Jada. I had you happily sign those corporate restructuring documents 2 years ago, while you were too busy planning a luxury vacation to even read the fine print. You willingly and legally signed away 85% of your equity directly into my private blind trust. I own the holding company. I own the beachfront villa. You are just a temporary, useless guest sleeping in my bed." Jada shook her head rapidly side to side, completely refusing to believe the absolute nightmare violently unfolding right in front of her. "Why would you do this terrible thing to me?" she sobbed, hugging her arms tightly across her chest to stop the violent shivering. "I loved you, Preston. I defended you against my own mother. I completely destroyed my relationship with my entire family just to protect you. I took my own children away from their grandmother for you." Preston looked down at her with pure, unadulterated disgust twisting his arrogant face. "You did not protect me, Jada," he sneered, his words dripping with pure, toxic venom. "You were just a highly convenient human shield. Do you honestly think I married you because I loved your sparkling personality or your sharp intellect? You are a spoiled, completely entitled idiot who throws massive temper tantrums when her designer credit cards get declined at the mall. You have absolutely no real-world survival skills and no intellectual value whatsoever. The only slightly attractive thing about you was your father's massive, heavy bank account. Marcus was a gullible, pathetic old man who desperately wanted a white son-in-law to make him feel like he had finally arrived in high society circles. I played the loving husband role perfectly, and he blindly handed me the master keys to his entire financial kingdom. Now that the corporate money is completely frozen and Marcus is rotting in the ground, you have absolutely no value left to offer me." The massive screaming match echoed violently down the long, empty-carpeted hallways of the beachfront mansion. Jada turned around and ran desperately out of the dark home office, tears streaming heavily down her ruined face. She ran directly to the luxurious downstairs guest suite and pounded her small fists violently against the heavy wooden door. She needed her grandmother right now. She needed Estelle to wrap her arms around her and fiercely tell her that everything was going to be all right. Estelle slowly opened the door wearing an expensive silk robe. She had clearly heard every single word of the violent, screaming argument from down the hall. Her wrinkled face was completely stern cold and entirely unsympathetic. Jada fell heavily to her knees on the soft plush carpet, weeping loudly and desperately begging her grandmother for protection and comfort. "He is taking absolutely everything." Grandma Jada sobbed uncontrollably, gripping the hem of Estelle's robe. "He legally stole the house, and he is divorcing me. We have to call the police right now. We have to hire the best lawyers to completely destroy him." Estelle looked down at her completely broken granddaughter and sighed heavily with deep, profound, bitter disappointment. She did not reach out to gently touch her hair. She did not offer a single word of warm maternal comfort. "Stand up, Jada." Estelle commanded, her shrill voice cold and completely calculating. "Stop crying on my floor like a weak, pathetic little child. This disaster is entirely your own fault." Jada stopped crying for a brief, confusing second, staring up at her grandmother in absolute, pure shock. "My fault?" Jada asked, her voice trembling violently with fresh disbelief. "How is his massive criminal betrayal my fault, Grandma?" Estelle crossed her bony arms tightly over her chest, looking down at Jada with absolute disdain. A smart, capable woman knows exactly how to keep her husband happy and completely satisfied. Estelle lectured, her tone dripping with harsh, unforgiving judgment. "You completely failed to manage your own marriage. You blindly let him handle all the complicated legal paperwork because you were entirely too busy shopping and acting like a lazy, useless princess. If you had been a much better, more attentive wife, he would never have looked for a secret exit strategy. Now you have completely lost the massive house, you have lost your wealthy husband, and you have completely ruined the high social standing of this entire family. I cannot possibly help a weak woman who is entirely incapable of keeping her own man in line." Estelle slowly and deliberately closed the heavy wooden door, completely shutting Jada out in the cold, dark hallway. The sharp click of the door lock sounded like a loud gunshot in the quiet house. Jada was entirely, completely alone. The massive $5 million house she proudly thought she owned was actually a highly elaborate prison built specifically to completely destroy her future. She had absolutely no money, no loving husband, no supportive grandmother, and no real home. She had aggressively alienated every single friend she ever had by acting superior and incredibly arrogant over the years. There was only one single person left in the entire world who actually had the massive financial power, the legal authority, and the sheer ruthless intellect to completely destroy Preston. Jada ran frantically to the front door, grabbing her car keys and running out into the freezing night, leaving all of her expensive designer clothes completely behind. She drove recklessly through the dark, winding roads of the island, her mind entirely consumed by absolute panic. The heavy freezing rain began to pour down violently from the black sky, crashing heavily against the windshield of her car. She drove blindly onto the late-night ferry, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned completely white. She drove for several long, agonizing hours until she finally reached the familiar, quiet suburban streets of her childhood neighborhood. The massive storm raged heavily around her, violently shaking the small car as she slowly pulled into the familiar concrete driveway. The heavy rain was completely flooding my front lawn when the doorbell suddenly rang in the middle of the dark night. I was still sitting awake in my home office reviewing the forensic documents. I stood up slowly from my heavy oak desk and walked quietly down the long hallway to the front door. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open, looking out into the freezing, violent storm. Standing alone on my concrete porch, completely soaked to the bone, shivering violently and crying hysterically, was my daughter. Her designer trench coat was completely ruined. Her hair was heavily plastered to her wet face. Jada fell heavily to her knees right there on the freezing wet concrete directly in front of me. "Mom, please help me," she begged loudly, her voice cracking over the loud sound of the crashing thunder. "You were completely right about absolutely everything, Mom. He legally stole everything from me. He is leaving me with absolutely nothing. Please, save me, Mom." I stood perfectly still in the warm, dry doorway, looking down at the daughter who had legally kidnapped my precious grandchildren just a few days ago. I did not reach out to help her up from the wet ground. I did not offer her a warm towel or a single drop of maternal sympathy. I looked at her with absolute calculated focus. "I am not your savior, Jada," I said, my voice perfectly steady, loud and completely cold, piercing through the heavy rain. "I am your auditor. You want my help. You surrender your shares of the company to me." The heavy rain was still pouring violently outside my window when Jada finally stopped crying on my front porch. She had come to my doorstep completely expecting me to wrap my arms around her and play the role of the endlessly forgiving mother. She expected me to instantly forget that she had legally weaponized my own grandchildren against me just a few days ago. But I was entirely done being the soft landing pad for the selfish people in my life. I told her I would absolutely help her completely destroy Preston, but my ultimate price was total, absolute surrender. I demanded she legally transfer her remaining 15% equity in the logistics company holding structure entirely back to me. I wanted total, absolute control of the corporate board. Jada was completely broken and entirely desperate. She walked into my dry foyer shivering violently and signed the legal transfer documents right there on my kitchen counter without a single moment of hesitation. Once I had her signature safely secured in my heavy leather briefcase, I called her a cab and sent her directly to a cheap budget motel on the edge of town. I was not going to let her sleep in my house. She needed to finally learn exactly what it felt like to survive in the real world without a massive safety net. The very next morning, the heavy rain finally cleared, leaving a bright, cold sky over the city of Boston. I drove downtown to meet Sterling at his corporate law office. He was looking much better than the last time I saw him. The sheer panic had completely faded from his eyes, replaced by a sharp, renewed professional focus. I sat across from his massive wooden desk and handed him the new equity transfer documents. With Jada officially removed from the corporate equation, I was finally completely ready to launch my massive legal assault directly against Preston. I was not going to waste my time fighting in probate court, trying to slowly overturn a complicated 5-year-old will. That was exactly what Preston and his highly expensive lawyers were eagerly waiting for. They wanted a long, drawn-out, emotional battle over the estate where they could drag my name through the mud and slowly drain my resources. But I am a certified public accountant. I do not fight emotional battles. I execute highly targeted financial strikes. I instructed Sterling to immediately file a massive civil lawsuit against Preston and the Ocean View Holdings Limited Liability Company under the highly specific legal doctrine of a constructive trust. A constructive trust is an equitable remedy imposed by a court to completely prevent unjust enrichment. It legally argues that the person currently holding the property only acquired it through massive fraud, deceit, or a severe breach of fiduciary duty. If the court successfully imposes a constructive trust, it legally strips the massive property away from the thief and returns it directly to the absolute rightful owner. Sterling looked at me with wide, impressed eyes as I laid out the meticulous financial timeline I had spent weeks building. I did not just track the stolen commercial electricity or the phantom consulting fees. I had dug entirely to the absolute bottom of the initial $5 million property purchase. For weeks, I had wondered exactly how Marcus managed to secure such a massive sum of liquid cash 5 years ago without completely bankrupting the logistics company. The terrible answer was deeply hidden inside a very old, forgotten bank account. Before I even met Marcus 35 years ago, my grandfather had left me a substantial pre-marital inheritance securely locked in a high-yield trust fund. I had purposely left that money completely untouched for decades, letting the compound interest grow silently in the background. It was my ultimate emergency safety net. But 5 years ago, when Preston demanded massive capital to fund his illegal cryptocurrency mining operation, Marcus did the unthinkable. He completely forged my legal signature on a series of complex banking release forms. He illegally dissolved my premarital trust fund, cashing out the entire massive balance, and quietly routing my own personal inherited money directly into the shell company to purchase the Marthas Vineyard villa. He stole my past to fund his arrogant son-in-law. The lawsuit hit Preston like a massive financial earthquake. Within exactly 48 hours, his hidden bank accounts were completely flagged, his credit was entirely ruined, and he was legally summoned to appear for an emergency sworn deposition in a downtown conference room. I walked into the bright, sterile deposition room wearing a sharp black tailored suit and a pristine white silk blouse. I took my seat next to Sterling, looking completely calm and utterly dangerous. Preston walked into the room a few minutes later, accompanied by a sleazy, high-powered defense attorney named Richard Vance. Richard was exactly the kind of lawyer who wore completely overly expensive cologne and smiled like a hungry shark. He was famous in the city for legally protecting wealthy, arrogant men who committed massive financial crimes. Preston looked incredibly smug, sitting down in his leather chair adjusting his expensive silk tie. He genuinely thought he was going to easily win this legal battle on a simple technicality. The court reporter swore Preston in, and the deposition formally began. Sterling laid out the massive, comprehensive paper trail of the forged signatures, the stolen inheritance money, and the illegal shell company transfers. He methodically presented the exact bank routing numbers, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that every single penny used to purchase the $5 million house belonged exclusively to me. Richard Vance simply leaned back in his chair, smiling that horrible, arrogant shark smile. He completely ignored the mountain of undeniable financial evidence resting heavily on the conference table. "That is a very lovely and highly detailed financial story," Sterling Richard said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But it is entirely legally, completely irrelevant. You are openly accusing my client of being the beneficiary of a massive fraudulent transaction orchestrated by the late Marcus. But according to your own meticulous records, this alleged financial forgery occurred exactly 5 years ago." Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows aggressively on the table. "The legal statute of limitations for civil fraud in this state is strictly limited to 3 years. Your client completely missed her legal window to file a claim. You cannot legally sue my client for a financial transaction that falls completely outside the allowed statutory timeframe. The property legally belongs to the limited liability company, and the company legally belongs to Preston. This entire lawsuit is absolutely nothing but a frivolous, desperate attempt by a grieving, bitter widow to steal back a house she never legally owned. I am filing a motion to dismiss this entire case tomorrow morning with extreme prejudice. Preston looked across the table at me and actually smirked. It was the exact same sickeningly arrogant smirk he had worn in the Marthas Vineyard foyer the very night I found out about the massive betrayal. He truly believed he had beaten me. He believed his sleazy, expensive lawyer had successfully discovered the perfect legal loophole to let him walk away with my $5 million house and my grandfather's stolen inheritance. He thought the heavy ticking clock of the legal system had officially completely saved him. I did not react. I simply turned my head very slightly and looked at Sterling. Over the past few weeks, Sterling had been incredibly terrified of Preston. He had cowered in his office, worried about his own career and entirely desperate to avoid any major conflict. But seeing Preston sit there smiling so arrogantly after stealing millions of dollars and destroying our entire family finally completely snapped something deep inside the corporate lawyer. Sterling did not cower today. He slowly stood up from his leather chair, his posture completely straight and his face set in a mask of pure professional absolute determination. Sterling reached calmly into his heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a single pristine sheet of paper enclosed in a thick protective plastic sleeve. He completely ignored Richard's arrogant legal ranting and looked directly into Preston's pale, confident eyes. The statute of limitations for civil financial fraud begins ticking on the exact date the fraud is legally discovered, Richard Sterling said, his voice ringing loudly and clearly through the quiet deposition room. And my client did not legally discover this massive financial theft until the exact night your client proudly presented her with the fraudulent trust documents after the funeral. Richard scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. You cannot possibly prove that in a court of law, Sterling. You cannot prove what she knew or did not know 5 years ago. She was the chief financial officer of the logistics company. A judge will absolutely assume she had total constructive knowledge of the missing funds. Your argument is completely weak and entirely circumstantial. Sterling smiled a cold, highly calculated smile that actually made Richard entirely pause. I do not need to rely on circumstantial evidence, Richard Sterling replied calmly, sliding the protected sheet of paper slowly across the smooth conference table directly toward the sleazy defense attorney. Because I have a signed, sworn, and officially notarized legal confession. The smug, confident smile completely vanished from Preston's face in a single, terrifying instant. He leaned forward, staring intensely at the piece of paper resting on the table. Marcus suffered a sudden, fatal brain aneurysm. Sterling continued, his voice completely steady and utterly devastating. But he had been suffering from severe chronic cluster headaches and dangerously high blood pressure for several months prior to his death. He knew his health was rapidly failing. He knew he was standing completely on the absolute edge of his own grave, and the heavy, crushing guilt of completely ruining his wife's life to fund your illegal criminal enterprise finally became entirely too much for him to bear. Sterling tapped his index finger firmly on the bottom of the document, pointing directly to a familiar messy signature and a bright blue official notary stamp. Exactly 2 days before he collapsed and died, Marcus visited a private notary public completely alone. Sterling announced the truth echoing violently in the small room. He wrote a detailed, comprehensive confession explicitly outlining exactly how he forged Clarice's signature, completely drained her premarital inheritance trust, and hid the massive stolen funds inside the shell company you legally designed. He explicitly named you, Preston, as the absolute primary architect of the entire massive financial crime. He placed this sworn legal confession inside a sealed envelope and locked it securely inside a private bank safety deposit box that only Clarice had the legal key to open. I watched Preston's arrogant face turn completely sickly gray. His hands began to shake violently on top of the conference table. His sleazy lawyer Richard stared down at the notarized confession, entirely completely speechless, realizing his entire legal defense had just been completely violently annihilated in a matter of seconds. "Marcus knew exactly what kind of monster you were," Preston Sterling said, delivering the absolute final blow. "He knew you were going to completely betray his daughter and steal the massive house. He left this confession specifically so Clarice could use it to completely destroy you, and that is exactly what she is going to do." The absolute silence in the deposition room after Sterling presented the notarized confession was the sweetest sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Preston and his expensive, sleazy lawyer looked entirely, completely defeated. But a civil lawsuit, no matter how incredibly strong the evidence might be, still takes a considerable amount of time to officially process through the slow court system. I did not have the patience to sit around and wait for a judge to bang a wooden gavel, while Preston desperately tried to find another dirty way out of his massive financial mess. I wanted him entirely, completely suffocated right now. And fortunately for me, the federal government moves much faster than a civil judge when they smell massive amounts of unpaid taxes. Weeks before the deposition, when I first uncovered the massive cryptocurrency mining operation in the basement of the Marthas Vineyard villa, I did not just file a standard suspicious activity report. I compiled a massive, incredibly detailed dossier of Preston's illegal digital income, the stolen corporate electricity, and the entirely unreported capital gains. I anonymously mailed the entire heavy package directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. I knew exactly how ruthless the federal tax authorities could be when dealing with massive, unreported offshore income. They do not send polite letters asking for a friendly meeting. They strike with absolute devastating force. The federal hammer finally dropped exactly 2 days after the disastrous deposition. Without any prior warning, the Internal Revenue Service officially initiated a massive, comprehensive audit of Ocean View Holdings, Limited Liability Company, and Preston's Personal Financial Trust. The moment the federal agents saw the glaring, massive holes in his tax returns and the millions of dollars in highly leveraged illegal cryptocurrency debt, they did exactly what they do best. They completely froze every single financial asset bearing Preston's name. They locked down his private bank accounts, his investment portfolios, and his emergency offshore funds. But the absolute crowning achievement of my strategic financial strike was the massive federal tax lien. The Internal Revenue Service officially slapped a $1.2 million tax lien directly onto the $5 million beachfront villa. A tax lien is a legal claim against an asset used to secure the massive payment of federal taxes. It meant Preston could not legally sell the house, could not legally refinance the property, and could not use it as collateral to borrow money from his dangerous private lenders. The house was completely, entirely frozen, heavily chained to a massive federal debt that Preston had absolutely no way of ever paying back. The financial lockdown hit the arrogant members of my family like a massive, violent hurricane. Estelle, who had proudly maintained her wealthy socialite lifestyle for decades, suddenly found herself standing at the checkout counter of a high-end luxury department store, completely humiliated. She tried to purchase a $3,000 designer coat using a supplemental credit card Preston had previously given her. The cashier swiped the expensive card 3 times before politely informing my deeply arrogant mother-in-law that the account had been completely forcibly closed by a federal order. Estelle tried to scream at the poor cashier, but her loud, wealthy entitlement was absolutely, completely useless against the United States federal government. She was forced to walk out of the luxury store empty-handed while the other wealthy shoppers stared at her in complete disgust. Her fake financial empire was completely crumbling right in front of her eyes. Meanwhile, the situation inside the massive Marthas Vineyard villa was rapidly deteriorating into absolute pure chaos. I knew exactly what was happening because Jada, despite being banished to a cheap budget motel, simply could not resist the heavy temptation to return to the island. The cheap motel walls were too thin, the bed was too hard, and she desperately wanted her expensive designer clothes and her heavy diamond jewelry. She drove back to this massive beachfront property, completely unannounced, entirely expecting to quietly sneak in, pack her expensive belongings into heavy suitcases, and leave before Preston even knew she was there. But when Jada arrived at the massive $5 million house, she did not find a luxurious, peaceful sanctuary. She found a dark, freezing tomb. The massive electric utility company, having finally realized that the commercial accounts were entirely frozen and the previous bills had bounced heavily, had officially completely shut off the power to the entire property. The massive industrial-grade air conditioning units in the basement were completely silent. The expensive custom refrigerator in the massive kitchen was entirely warm, and the food inside was already beginning to completely rot. The beautiful crystal chandelier in the grand foyer hung completely dark and useless. Jada unlocked the front door and walked into the dark, freezing house. She found Preston pacing violently back and forth across the imported marble floors of the massive living room. He looked entirely, completely deranged. He had not shaved in several days. His expensive clothes were heavily wrinkled and stained, and his pale eyes were completely wild with absolute, unadulterated panic. The dangerous, illegal creditors were calling his dead cell phone constantly, and he had absolutely no way to access his frozen digital currency. The federal tax lien had completely destroyed his only massive asset. When Preston saw Jada walking into the dark living room wearing her expensive coat and holding a large empty travel bag, he did not apologize for drafting the divorce papers. He did not ask her for forgiveness. He saw exactly one thing. He saw the heavy diamond engagement ring shining on her finger and the thick, expensive gold necklace resting around her neck. He stopped pacing and walked aggressively toward her, his large physical frame completely blocking the exit. His voice was harsh, desperate, and completely terrifying. "Give me the jewelry, Jada," he demanded, holding his shaking hand out toward her. "Take off the rings, the necklace, and the diamond earrings right now. I need to take them to a pawn shop in the city. I need the liquid cash to turn the power back on and pay off the initial interest on my private loans. Give them to me right this exact second." Jada took a massive step backward, entirely, completely terrified of the violent, desperate man standing in front of her. She wrapped her hands tightly around her heavy gold necklace, completely refusing to surrender the very last valuable items she actually owned. "No!" she cried, her voice echoing loudly in the dark, freezing room. "These are my personal belongings, Preston. You have already completely stolen my entire house and destroyed my relationship with my family. You are absolutely not taking my jewelry." Preston completely lost whatever tiny remaining fraction of his sanity he still possessed. He lunged violently forward, grabbing Jada roughly by the shoulders and shaking her heavily. "You stupid, arrogant little girl," he screamed, spit flying from his dry lips, hitting her terrified face. "Do you completely understand what kind of dangerous people I owe money to? They do not care about your stupid designer clothes or your expensive feelings. They are going to come to this house and completely destroy me. I need that jewelry right now to save my life." Jada screamed loudly, completely struggling to break entirely free from his violent, heavy grip. She kicked his leg heavily with her designer boot, forcing him to briefly release her shoulders. She turned around and ran desperately toward the grand staircase, trying to reach the master bedroom to lock herself safely inside. But Preston was much faster and entirely fueled by massive, desperate adrenaline. He grabbed the heavy collar of her expensive coat and violently threw her backward toward the massive double front doors. "Get out!" he roared, his voice echoing violently like a massive wild animal entirely trapped in a cage. "If you are not going to give me the jewelry, you can get out of my house. You are completely, entirely useless to me now." He pushed her forcefully out onto the cold concrete porch, slamming the heavy wooden double doors shut right in her face. The loud, heavy click of the deadbolt locking echoed loudly in the freezing night air. Jada pounded her fists frantically against the solid wood, but Preston was already completely gone. I was sitting quietly in my suburban home office, sipping a warm cup of herbal tea and reviewing the final legal documents from Sterling. The house was completely peaceful and entirely silent. I was finally starting to feel the heavy dark cloud of the past few months lifting from my tired shoulders. The legal trap had successfully closed, and Preston was entirely suffocating under the massive weight of his own criminal greed. I was fully prepared to let the federal government handle the rest of his miserable life. Suddenly, my cell phone lit up brightly on the large oak desk. The sudden vibration startled me in the quiet room. I reached out and picked up the device, looking at the bright screen. It was a single text message from Jada. I expected it to be another pathetic complaint about the cheap motel or another demand for more of my personal money. But when I read the short, terrifying sentence displayed on the glowing screen, my blood instantly ran completely cold. "Mom, please call the police right now." Jada wrote her words typed in absolute frantic haste. "He has a gun. He is destroying the house." I stared at the bright screen of my cell phone, reading the frantic text message from my daughter over and over again. "He has a gun." Jada wrote her words typed in absolute frantic haste. "He is destroying the house." A normal mother might have panicked. A normal mother might have jumped into her car and driven recklessly through the night to try and save her child from a violent, dangerous situation. But I am not a normal mother, and I am certainly no longer a victim. I knew perfectly well that Preston was a coward. He was a desperate, weak man who used intimidation to control the women around him, but he lacked the actual courage to pull a trigger. He was not destroying the house to hurt Jada. He was destroying the house because he was completely trapped and lashing out like a pathetic caged animal. I did not rush out the door. I simply picked up my phone and calmly dialed the local police department in Marthas Vineyard. When the dispatch officer answered the phone, I kept my voice entirely steady and completely professional. I told the officer my name and stated clearly that I was the primary legal stakeholder of the Ocean View Holdings Limited Liability Company. I reported a violent domestic disturbance currently in progress at my beachfront property. I informed them that a man named Preston was heavily armed and actively destroying the physical assets inside the house. I made absolutely sure to emphasize the property destruction. I was not calling the authorities to save Preston from himself. I was calling the police to legally document his violent destruction of my expensive property. I needed an official police report to permanently seal his fate in the civil lawsuit and ensure he would be held entirely financially responsible for every single broken window and shattered piece of marble. I sat quietly in my home office, sipping my herbal tea, while the police units immediately swarmed the massive $5 million villa. I later read the official police report, which detailed the entire pathetic scene. Preston had taken a heavy golf club and completely smashed the custom wet bar, shattering thousands of dollars worth of premium liquor bottles across the pristine rugs. He had broken the massive floor-to-ceiling windows facing the dark ocean. When the armed officers kicked the front doors open, they found him sitting on the imported marble floor, completely surrounded by broken glass, weeping loudly like a helpless child. He did not even attempt to fight the officers. They forced him onto his stomach, placed heavy steel handcuffs tightly around his wrists, and dragged him out of the beautiful house he claimed to own. They arrested him for felony destruction of property and severe domestic disturbance. Preston was finally locked inside a cold concrete jail cell where his unearned white privilege could no longer protect him from the brutal consequences of his own absolute stupidity. With Preston sitting securely in a county jail cell and Jada completely terrified out of her mind hiding in her cheap budget motel, I thought the massive financial puzzle was finally completely solved. I thought I had successfully reclaimed my stolen inheritance and secured my absolute revenge. But my dead husband Marcus had left one final horrifying trap completely buried beneath the paperwork. The very next morning, the heavy rain had passed, but the air remained completely bitter and cold. I was sitting at my kitchen table organizing the final legal transfer documents when the mail carrier dropped a thick certified envelope into my mailbox. I walked outside to retrieve it, completely expecting it to be another desperate legal motion from Preston's sleazy defense attorney. But the heavy envelope bore the bold official logo of a massive national commercial bank. I carried it back inside, sat down at my table, and tore open the thick paper. I pulled out a massive stack of highly official banking documents and began to read. Within exactly 3 minutes, my entire world shifted violently on its axis once again. The absolute sheer magnitude of Marcus' betrayal was infinitely worse than I had ever possibly imagined. When Marcus originally forged my signature 5 years ago, he did steal my entire $5 million premarital inheritance to purchase the beachfront villa. But the criminal greed did not stop there. The documents in my hands were official commercial mortgage statements. 3 years ago, when Preston's illegal cryptocurrency mining operation began bleeding massive amounts of cash, Marcus did not just use my logistics company to pay the massive stolen electricity bills. He quietly went to a commercial bank and leveraged the massive equity of the beachfront villa. Because the house was fully paid off using my stolen cash, Marcus was able to successfully take out a massive $3 million commercial mortgage loan directly against the physical property. He completely mortgaged the house to generate a massive pile of liquid cash to cover Preston's catastrophic digital losses. And because Preston was a completely incompetent fraud who lost absolutely everything he touched, the monthly mortgage payments had entirely stopped being made exactly 6 months ago. The heavy certified letter I was holding was not just a simple late notice. It was an official final notice of absolute foreclosure. The National Bank was legally seizing the massive $5 million beachfront property to immediately satisfy the outstanding $3 million debt. The official county auction was heavily scheduled to take place in exactly 7 days at the primary municipal courthouse. The strict banking timeline allowed absolutely no room for standard legal maneuvering or lengthy appeals. If the outstanding balance was not paid in full in certified funds before the loud gavel hit the wooden podium, the property would instantly belong to the highest bidder. I sat at my kitchen table, entirely paralyzed by the absolute staggering weight of the financial betrayal. Marcus had not just stolen my past to buy a house for his spoiled daughter. He had intentionally mortgaged my stolen past to completely cover the massive criminal debts of his arrogant son-in-law. He had completely destroyed my entire financial legacy twice over. If the bank foreclosed on the property and sold it at public auction, my stolen $5 million inheritance would be entirely wiped out forever. I would completely lose the house, the massive equity, and everything I had spent the last month fighting so viciously to successfully reclaim. The sheer absolute cruelty of my dead husband was completely breathtaking. He had planned absolutely every single detail to completely trap me no matter which way I decided to turn. He made sure that even if I somehow managed to defeat Preston and successfully reclaim the limited liability company, I would be handed a massive, worthless pile of suffocating commercial debt. I placed the heavy foreclosure notice carefully on the kitchen counter, taking a very deep, slow breath. I did not cry. I did not scream. I felt an entirely new level of absolute cold calculation completely wash over my mind. The federal tax lien, the divorce papers, the broken trust documents, and now a massive commercial foreclosure. It was a perfect, massive storm of complete, absolute financial destruction. A few hours later, I heard a slow, familiar car pull into my concrete driveway. I looked through the front window and saw Estelle stepping out of an expensive luxury sedan. She looked completely pathetic. Her expensive clothes were slightly wrinkled, her designer hair was completely flat, and she walked with a heavy, slow limp that she completely exaggerated for maximum dramatic effect. She walked up to my front door and knocked softly, entirely abandoning her usual loud, demanding attitude. The arrogant queen of high society had been completely stripped of her golden crown, and she was now entirely reduced to a desperate, begging peasant standing quietly on my wet concrete porch. I opened the door and looked at her. Her wrinkled face was completely covered in heavy fake tears. Her eyes were red, and she held a small white tissue to her nose, completely playing the role of the desperate, completely broken elderly grandmother. She looked absolutely pathetic, but I knew it was nothing but a highly calculated performance. "Clarice," she whimpered, her shrill voice completely dropping to a soft, pathetic whisper. "Please let me inside. I am completely terrified and entirely alone." I stepped aside and let her walk into my quiet suburban home. She walked directly into the living room and sat down heavily on the sofa, looking around the room as if she were desperately seeking absolute sanctuary. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a fresh cup of warm herbal tea, and walked back into the living room. I remained standing, completely towering over her physical form. "I know absolutely everything," Estelle cried, wiping a fake tear from her cheek. "I know Preston is sitting in a jail cell. I know Jada is completely destitute, living in a terrible cheap motel. And I just received a horrible, frantic phone call from the bank executives. They told me the beachfront house is going into massive public foreclosure in exactly 7 days. They said Marcus took out a massive $3 million loan and completely lost it all." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with entirely manufactured desperation. "You have to save us, Clarice," she begged, her voice trembling violently. "You are the only person left who has the massive liquid capital to completely fix this absolute nightmare. You have your personal retirement accounts, and you have the complete total control of the logistics company operating funds. You have to immediately wire $3 million to the commercial bank and completely pay off the outstanding mortgage." I took a slow, warm sip of my tea, watching her completely humiliate herself. "If you do not pay off the mortgage right now, the bank will completely sell the beautiful house at public auction," Estelle continued, weeping loudly. "We will completely lose the entire massive property. We will lose the absolute final piece of Marcus' beautiful legacy. I have absolutely nowhere else to go, Clarice. I cannot maintain my expensive lifestyle. You have to save the family legacy. You are the only one who completely understands how to legally manage these massive financial disasters. Please, Clarice, please pay the bank." She reached her shaking hands out toward me, completely, entirely expecting me to immediately surrender my hard-earned money to save the massive physical symbol of her own arrogant greed. She thought I would blindly throw $3 million into a massive burning fire just to protect the fake family image she worshipped so deeply. I looked down at her pathetic, crying face. I thought about the decades of absolute cruelty she had forced me to endure. I thought about the stolen inheritance, the forged signatures, the terrible screaming arguments, and the sheer absolute arrogance she had proudly displayed when she told me I was completely, entirely worthless. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for her. I lowered my teacup completely, holding her desperate gaze with my own absolute cold, dead stare. My voice was entirely smooth, completely flat, and utterly merciless. "I am not paying a single dime, Estelle," I said, watching the fake hope completely drain from her pale, wrinkled face. "I am not going to blindly throw my own money away to save your pathetic illusions. I am letting it go to public auction." The morning of the county foreclosure auction arrived with a thick blanket of gray fog, rolling heavily off the cold harbor. I drove downtown to the massive municipal courthouse, wearing my sharpest tailored burgundy business suit. I carried my simple black leather briefcase tightly in my hand. Inside the historic courthouse, the main auction room was already completely crowded with local real estate vultures. These were wealthy, opportunistic investors looking to buy up broken financial dreams for absolute pennies on the dollar. I walked quietly to the very back row of the large room and took a seat on the hard wooden bench. I placed my numbered bidding paddle completely face down on my lap. I was absolutely not there to participate in a loud, desperate shouting match. I was there to execute the absolute final phase of my master financial strategy. Just 10 minutes before the auctioneer was scheduled to take the podium, the heavy wooden double doors at the back of the room swung wide open. Preston walked in. He was officially out of the county jail on a massive bail bond, probably secured by completely draining the last remaining pennies of his emergency offshore accounts. He looked entirely different from the violent, desperate man who had shattered the beachfront villa windows just 7 days ago. He had shaved his face and put on a cheap, shiny suit that did not fit his large frame correctly. He was walking closely with a tall, incredibly thin white man wearing a loud, checkered blazer and carrying a thick leather binder. The man had the cold, calculating eyes of a shady private moneylender. He was exactly the kind of bottom-feeding investor Preston would desperately partner with when traditional banks completely refused to take his phone calls. Preston scanned the crowded room, and his pale eyes immediately locked onto me, sitting quietly in the back row. A sickeningly familiar smirk slowly spread across his arrogant face. He nudged the shady investor, and they walked proudly down the center aisle directly toward my bench. Preston stopped right in front of me, completely blocking my view of the front podium. He crossed his arms tightly over his chest, looking down at me with absolute unfiltered arrogance. "Hello, Clarice," he said, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. "I am honestly incredibly surprised to see you sitting here today. I thought you would be entirely too humiliated to show your face in public after losing your massive civil lawsuit leverage." I did not say a single word. I just looked up at him, keeping my face perfectly blank and completely unbothered. Preston leaned forward, resting his hands heavily on the wooden bench directly next to me. "You really thought you had me completely trapped," he whispered, his voice filled with venomous pride. "You thought the federal tax lien and the massive commercial bank foreclosure would entirely destroy me. But you completely forgot how the real estate game is actually played. When a commercial bank forecloses on a massive property and sells it at a public county auction, it legally completely wipes the physical property clean of all secondary liens and previous legal attachments. That means your little federal tax trap and your stupid civil lawsuit completely vanish into thin air the absolute second the auctioneer bangs his wooden gavel." Preston gestured proudly to the sleazy man standing right next to him. "My new private financial partner and I have formed a brand new anonymous limited liability company," he explained, his massive ego completely inflating with every single word. "We are going to buy the beachfront villa right here today for absolute pennies on the dollar. Since nobody else in this miserable room has the massive liquid capital to bid on a $5 million luxury property, we will easily secure the winning bid. The bank gets their cheap payout, the federal government loses their massive tax lien, and I get my beautiful house right back completely free and clear of your pathetic legal claims. You did all that exhausting forensic accounting work for absolutely nothing, Clarice. You are walking away from this entirely, completely empty-handed." He laughed a dark, highly arrogant chuckle and walked away, taking a seat in the very front row with his shady investor. I sat completely still in the back row, my breathing perfectly steady and calm. Preston thought he was a brilliant financial mastermind. He truly believed he had discovered the ultimate legal loophole to completely cheat the federal government and steal my inheritance for the second time. He understood the basic mechanical rules of a public foreclosure auction, but he completely lacked the high-level forensic vision to see the massive invisible trap I had already set directly underneath his feet. A true certified public accountant does not just read the surface-level regulations. We read the absolute deepest layers of the financial code. The loud, heavy sound of a microphone clicking on echoed through the large courthouse room. The auctioneer, a tall, balding man wearing a dark suit, stepped up to the front wooden podium. He quickly read through the standard legal disclaimers and the strict rules of the county auction. The bidding was strictly cash or certified bank wire only. No credit, no traditional mortgages, and absolutely no delays. The room grew completely silent as the auctioneer officially opened the massive catalog of foreclosed properties. He moved quickly through several smaller residential homes and vacant commercial lots before finally reaching the absolute crown jewel of the morning docket. The next property is a massive 3-story luxury beachfront villa located in the highly exclusive district of Marthas Vineyard. The auctioneer announced, his loud voice completely filling the tense room. The property features imported marble floors, custom architecture, and private oceanfront access. The initial starting bid to satisfy the outstanding commercial mortgage debt is strictly set at $1.5 million. The room immediately erupted into a flurry of quiet whispers. A $5 million luxury property starting at $1.5 million was an absolute dream for the wealthy investors sitting in the room. A woman in the third row raised her yellow paddle immediately. $1.5 million, the auctioneer called out quickly, pointing his hand toward her. A man sitting near the middle aisle raised his paddle high into the air. $1.6 million, the auctioneer chanted, scanning the room for more movement. The shady investor sitting directly next to Preston immediately aggressively shot his paddle high into the air. $2 million, the investor shouted, his voice loud and incredibly confident, completely startling the other casual bidders in the room. I sat entirely completely silent in the back row. My wooden bidding paddle remained completely face down on my lap. I did not move a single muscle. Preston turned his head around and looked directly back at me, a massive, arrogant grin plastered completely across his pale face. He watched me sitting there, making absolutely no move to participate in the massive bidding war. He genuinely thought I was completely financially paralyzed. He thought I simply did not have the massive liquid capital required to fight his shady private investor. The woman in the third row slowly raised her paddle again. 2.1 million, she called out, her voice slightly hesitant. The shady investor did not even wait for the auctioneer to acknowledge her bid. $2.5 million, the investor yelled, raising his paddle completely high above his head. The massive, aggressive jump in price completely sucked the remaining air out of the crowded room. $2.5 million was a massive amount of liquid cash to drop on a single foreclosed property in a matter of seconds. The woman in the third row slowly lowered her paddle, shaking her head in complete defeat. The man in the middle aisle crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair, completely dropping out of the race. The auctioneer looked around the quiet room, his eyes scanning the crowd for any remaining signs of movement. "I have $2.5 million going," once he called out, his voice echoing loudly against the tall walls. Preston turned around in his front row seat and looked directly at me again. He actually pointed his finger at me and laughed right in my face. It was a loud, obnoxious laugh of pure, unadulterated, arrogant victory. He thought he had officially completely won. He thought he had successfully stolen my money, outsmarted the massive commercial bank, and entirely humiliated me in public. $2.5 million going twice, the auctioneer shouted, leaning forward heavily over the podium. He picked up his heavy wooden gavel, holding it high in the air, ready to officially close the massive sale. "Sold to Mr. Preston," he announced, bringing the heavy wooden gavel down hard. "Wait," the auctioneer said, his voice echoing strangely through the microphone. He stopped completely, his eyes glued to the glowing computer monitor resting on the podium right in front of him. A loud, bright red notification banner was flashing violently across his official county screen. The entire room went completely dead silent, wondering exactly why the auctioneer had suddenly frozen completely in place. "I have an administrative override," the auctioneer read directly from the screen, his voice filled with absolute pure confusion. "The primary lien holder has exercised their right of first refusal. The property goes to Phoenix Rising Capital." Preston jumped aggressively out of his front row seat, his face turning completely bright red with sudden explosive panic. He looked wildly around the quiet room, his hands shaking violently at his sides. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice cracking with absolute pure terror. I slowly picked up my simple black leather briefcase from the hard wooden floor. I stood up tall from the hard wooden bench in the very back row of the quiet courthouse room. I smoothed down the front of my tailored burgundy suit, making absolutely sure my appearance was entirely perfectly flawless. Every single head in the crowded room slowly turned around to look directly at me. Preston turned around, his mouth hanging completely wide open, his pale eyes filled with absolute crushing, devastating horror. He finally, entirely, completely understood exactly what had just happened. I looked directly into his terrified eyes, completely relishing the absolute sheer perfection of the exact moment I completely destroyed his entire life. "That is me," I said. The entire courthouse room remained completely dead silent as the heavy weight of my words settled over the shocked crowd. I stood tall in the back row, holding my simple leather briefcase, while the auctioneer carefully reviewed the official legal documents flashing on his computer screen. "Yes," the auctioneer finally confirmed, his voice echoing loudly through the microphone. "The commercial mortgage debt was completely purchased 3 weeks ago by a private equity firm named Phoenix Rising Capital. As the primary debt holder, they have officially exercised their legal right to reclaim the physical property in lieu of the outstanding balance. The public auction for this specific property is permanently canceled." Preston looked like he was going to be physically sick. His pale face turned a sickly shade of gray, and his knees actually buckled slightly, causing him to grip the hard wooden bench for physical support. His shady private investor immediately realized the entire financial deal was completely dead. The investor shook his head in absolute disgust, grabbed his thick leather binder, and walked rapidly out of the courthouse without saying a single word to Preston. And right behind Preston, sitting quietly in the second row, wearing a cheap dark coat and looking completely terrified, was Estelle. She had come to the auction desperately hoping to see Preston win the house back so she could beg him for a place to live. Instead, she was watching her entire fake high society world completely burn to the ground right in front of her eyes. I walked slowly and deliberately down the center aisle of the courthouse, my tailored burgundy suit making me look exactly like the chief financial officer I truly was. The wealthy investors in the room quietly stepped out of my way, completely sensing the absolute dangerous power radiating from my every single step. I stopped directly in front of Preston and Estelle. They both looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, completely unable to comprehend the massive financial trap that had just violently snapped shut entirely around them. "How did you do this?" Preston whispered, his voice shaking so violently he could barely form the words. "You did not have $3 million in your personal bank accounts, Clarice. The logistics company operating funds were completely frozen. You could not possibly afford to buy the massive commercial debt from the National Bank." I looked at him and smiled a cold, ruthless smile. "I did not use my personal retirement savings, Preston." I explained, my voice perfectly steady and completely calm. "I used the corporate funds. You completely forgot one very important detail when you assumed I was just a bitter, grieving widow. Freezing a corporate bank account does not mean the money completely disappears. It simply means no unauthorized personnel can access the funds. As the legally documented chief financial officer of the logistics company, I retained complete, absolute executive authority over every single penny. I simply waited until the massive corporate accounts were legally audited and cleared of your fraudulent vendor charges. Then I authorized a completely legal corporate investment. I created a private shell corporation named Phoenix Rising Capital, and I used the logistics company money to quietly buy your commercial mortgage debt directly from the National Bank for absolute pennies on the dollar. I essentially purchased my own stolen inheritance back from the commercial banking institution." Estelle gasped loudly, covering her wrinkled mouth with her shaking hands. "You bought the debt!" she stammered, her shrill voice completely breaking under the massive realization. "You were the bank this entire time!" I turned my cold eyes directly toward my arrogant mother-in-law. "Yes, Estelle, I was the bank," I replied, staring directly into her entirely defeated soul. "When you came to my suburban house crying fake tears and desperately begging me to pay off the massive mortgage to save your precious family legacy, you were actually begging me to pay myself. I let you completely humiliate yourself on my front porch because I wanted you to finally understand exactly how it feels to be entirely, completely powerless. You treated me like dirt for 35 years because I came from a working-class background. You thought your elite social status made you completely untouchable, but your fake status was built entirely on massive lies and my stolen money. Now you have absolutely nothing left to hide behind." Preston shook his head rapidly, back and forth, his mind completely unable to process the absolute massive scale of his total defeat. "But why would you wait this long?" he demanded aggressively, his panic turning into desperate anger. "Why would you let the property go all the way to a public foreclosure auction if you already own the debt? You could have legally evicted me weeks ago." I crossed my arms tightly over my chest and looked at him with pure, unadulterated pity. "Because I wanted to completely, entirely destroy you, Preston," I stated flatly. "If I had simply evicted you right away, you would have walked away with a massive pile of illegal money hidden safely offshore. You would have hired expensive, sleazy lawyers and fought me in civil court for years. I needed you to completely bleed yourself dry. I let you hire Richard Vance and rack up hundreds of thousands of dollars in massive legal fees. I let you drain your emergency offshore accounts just to pay your massive bail bond after you violently destroyed my beautiful property. But most importantly, I needed to completely trap you with the federal government." I took a slow step closer, completely invading his personal space, forcing him to look directly into my eyes. "When I anonymously reported your illegal cryptocurrency mining operation to the Internal Revenue Service, they placed a massive $1.2 million tax lien directly onto the holding company," I explained slowly, ensuring he absorbed every single word. "But because you completely reorganized the holding company 2 years ago, legally stealing Jada's equity and placing the corporate ownership entirely under your own private trust, you legally assumed full personal responsibility for the massive tax debt. You dug your own grave, Preston. The realization hit his arrogant face like a physical brick wall. I watched his pale eyes widen in absolute pure horror as my brilliant financial logic finally completely washed over him. By letting the property go to an official public foreclosure auction, I triggered a highly specific legal mechanism. I continued my voice ringing clearly in the quiet courthouse. A formal commercial foreclosure legally completely wipes out all secondary liens attached to the physical property. That means the federal tax lien is no longer attached to the $5 million beachfront villa. I just legally bought my own house back completely free and clear of your massive criminal mess. The house belongs entirely exclusively to me. But the Internal Revenue Service does not just forgive a $1.2 million tax debt. Preston, I added, watching him physically tremble, the debt does not disappear. It simply transfers entirely directly onto you personally. You completely stole my inheritance. You ruined my family, and you tried to leave my daughter with absolutely nothing. Now you are standing here with absolutely no house, no money, no fake consulting salary, and absolutely no wife. Jada legally surrendered all her remaining corporate shares directly to me. She is currently living in a cheap budget motel and finalizing the divorce papers you so kindly drafted for her. You have absolutely nothing left, Preston. Your entire fraudulent existence has been completely permanently erased by the very woman you foolishly thought you could easily manipulate and completely destroy. Preston literally fell backward, hitting the hard wooden bench heavily. He stared blankly at the floor, completely broken and entirely defeated. His massive criminal empire had completely collapsed, crushing him entirely underneath the heavy rubble. Estelle sat right behind him, crying silently, her expensive makeup running heavily down her wrinkled cheeks. The arrogant, wealthy facade she had proudly worn for decades was entirely gone. She was just a sad, lonely old woman who had pushed everyone away out of pure toxic greed. I reached calmly into my simple black leather briefcase and pulled out a thick white envelope. I dropped it heavily onto Preston's lap. He flinched violently when the heavy paper hit his legs. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice completely hoarse and broken. I smoothed down my tailored burgundy suit one final time, feeling a deep, profound sense of absolute lasting victory. "That is a highly detailed, itemized invoice," I said, looking down at him. I smiled coldly, watching his entire body shake violently. "You honestly never truly understood exactly who you were dealing with. You arrogant and completely foolish little boy," I added. "And since you ran illegal crypto servers on my property, I billed you for the electricity and damages. See you in federal court. The FBI is waiting for you in the lobby." The crisp morning air of Marthas Vineyard felt entirely different as I drove my car down the familiar crushed gravel driveway of the massive beachfront villa. I was no longer an unwelcome guest or a completely betrayed widow discovering a horrific secret. I was the sole legal owner of the $5 million property, holding the pristine deed securely inside my heavy black leather briefcase. Right behind my car, a fully marked county sheriff cruiser rolled slowly onto the property. I had requested a formal civil standby to execute the official eviction notice. I knew perfectly well that Estelle would not simply pack her expensive bags and leave quietly into the morning fog. She was a woman who would rather burn a house completely to the ground than admit she had entirely lost her unearned high society throne forever. I parked my car and stepped out onto the driveway, buttoning my sharp-tailored charcoal coat against the cold ocean wind. The tall, uniformed sheriff stepped out of his cruiser, adjusting his heavy utility belt and nodding respectfully toward me. We walked up the wide wooden front steps together. The heavy double doors were completely unlocked. Preston had completely destroyed the heavy deadbolt when he locked Jada out during his violent rampage days ago. I pushed the broken doors open and walked into the grand foyer. The house was entirely silent and still incredibly cold. The utility companies had not yet restored the commercial electricity. I walked directly into the massive formal living room. Sitting right in the center of the imported white leather sofa, completely surrounded by a massive pile of empty, expensive Louis Vuitton travel bags, was Estelle. She was wearing a heavy designer fur coat inside the freezing house, refusing to let go of her wealthy image even in the dark. She sat perfectly, completely rigid, her wrinkled hands folded tightly on her lap, glaring at me with absolute pure, unadulterated hatred. She had absolutely no intention of packing a single piece of clothing. She honestly believed that if she simply sat there stubbornly enough, her sheer upper-class entitlement would somehow magically override a legal court order. The sheriff stepped forward, holding the official eviction paperwork clearly in his right hand. "Ma'am," he said, his voice loud, firm, and completely professional. "You have been officially served with a final notice of eviction. You must vacate this physical property immediately." Estelle completely ignored the armed law enforcement officer entirely. She kept her cold, furious eyes locked completely on my face. "You are a disgusting, highly vindictive woman, Clarice," she spat, her shrill voice echoing sharply in the large, cold room. "You stole my son's house. You completely destroyed my beautiful family. You belong back in the dirty, cheap apartment where Marcus found you 35 years ago." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of emotional distress. I stood tall and completely composed, looking down at the pathetic, broken woman sitting in the dark. "You have exactly 10 minutes to pack your personal belongings, Estelle." I said, my voice perfectly smooth and utterly merciless. "If you do not pack your expensive designer clothes, the sheriff is going to physically remove you from my private property, and your bags will be thrown directly into the outdoor trash bins." Estelle gasped loudly, her face turning a bright, sickly shade of angry red. She looked wildly at the sheriff, entirely expecting him to bow down to her perceived authority and arrest me instead. But the sheriff simply unclipped the heavy radio from his belt, taking a slow, intimidating step closer to the sofa. "You heard the owner, ma'am," he warned, his tone completely losing all previous polite patience. "You can either walk out that front door on your own 2 feet right now, or I will place you in heavy steel handcuffs for criminal trespassing and completely drag you out. The absolute choice is yours." The harsh, undeniable reality finally completely crashed down onto Estelle's arrogant shoulders. The sheer terror of being publicly arrested and dragged out of a luxury house in handcuffs finally broke her stubborn resistance. She stood up on shaking legs, her hands trembling violently as she haphazardly threw a few expensive silk blouses and heavy jewelry boxes into her open Louis Vuitton bags. She did not bother folding anything. She was moving in pure, frantic panic, entirely, completely humiliated by the presence of the armed officer, heavily watching her every single frantic move. She zipped the bags closed and dragged them awkwardly across the imported marble floor, heavily scratching the pristine surface. When she reached the massive grand foyer, she stopped and turned around to look at me one absolute final time. Her face was completely twisted into an ugly mask of pure toxic rage. "You completely ruined my family," she screamed, her voice cracking loudly with absolute desperation. "You ruined absolutely everything." I looked at her, completely, entirely devoid of any pity or human sympathy. "You ruined your own family." "Estelle," I replied, my voice completely flat, cold, and ringing clearly in the quiet foyer. "I just stopped funding your delusions. Now get out of my house." The sheriff placed his large, heavy hand firmly on her shoulder and physically guided her out the broken front doors. I watched entirely emotionlessly as she stumbled awkwardly down the wide wooden steps, dragging her heavy designer luggage behind her. She looked incredibly small, entirely pathetic, and completely broken. Her massive fake empire had finally entirely collapsed, leaving her with absolutely nothing but a few expensive bags and a massive bruised ego. I walked slowly out onto the wide front porch, taking a deep, slow breath of the fresh, cold ocean air. The heavy, toxic energy that had completely suffocated my entire life for 35 years was finally entirely gone. But my absolute final test of strength was completely waiting for me at the very bottom of the driveway. Standing quietly near the edge of the crushed gravel, completely shivering in the cold morning wind, was Jada. She was holding the hands of my 2 precious grandchildren, Maya and Leo. Jada looked entirely, completely exhausted. Her face was pale, her eyes were heavy with dark purple circles, and she was wearing the exact same clothes she had worn when she desperately ran to my suburban house days ago. She had entirely legally surrendered her remaining corporate shares to me, just like I heavily demanded. The divorce papers from Preston were officially filed, leaving her entirely destitute. She had absolutely nowhere else to go. I walked slowly down the wooden steps and across the crushed gravel, my heavy shoes crunching loudly in the quiet morning. Maya and Leo looked up at me with wide, innocent eyes, completely unaware of the massive financial war that had just completely destroyed their parents' lives. My heart physically ached, wanting absolutely nothing more than to wrap my arms tightly around their small, shivering bodies. But I completely forced myself to remain entirely stoic. I could not show any absolute weakness right now. Jada needed to learn the absolute hardest lesson of her entire spoiled life. Jada took a slow, hesitant step forward, her eyes completely filled with desperate, pleading tears. "Mom," she whispered, her voice shaking violently in the cold wind. "I saw the sheriff dragging Grandma out. I know you own the house now. I know you completely won." She looked down at the two shivering children holding tightly to her hands. "We have absolutely nowhere to go, Mom. The cheap motel kicked us out this morning because I ran completely out of money. Preston took absolutely everything. Please, Mom, please let us stay here in the big house with you. I will clean the floors. I will cook the meals. Just please do not leave us out here in the cold street." Her desperate begging was very pathetic. It was the culmination of 34 years of intense, unearned privilege crashing into reality. I looked directly into her crying eyes, keeping my face completely hard and unreadable. "I am not letting you move into this house, Jada," I said, my voice entirely firm, lacking any maternal comfort. Jada gasped, loudly, tears spilling heavily down her pale cheeks. "But Mom," she sobbed, "these are your grandchildren. You cannot simply throw us away. You helped them try to bury me." "Jada," I replied, my words cutting sharply through the cold morning air. I reached calmly into my tailored coat pocket and pulled out a simple, thin manila envelope, holding it out toward her. "You need to learn how to stand on your own 2 feet," I continued, my voice completely steady. Jada slowly reached out and took the thin envelope from my hand, opening it with violently trembling fingers. "Here is a lease for a 2-bedroom apartment," I explained, entirely coldly staring at her. "Rent is due on the 1st. 6 months later, the harsh, bitter winter finally gave way to a bright, warm, beautiful spring. I stood perfectly still in the center of the massive, grand foyer of my Marthas Vineyard villa, breathing in the fresh, clean ocean air flowing through the open windows. The house looked completely different. I had hired a massive team of professional contractors to completely gut the interior of the $5 million property. I completely erased every single lingering physical trace of Marcus, Preston, and Estelle. I threw away the pretentious imported white leather furniture Estelle had so proudly selected. I tore up the dark, heavy rugs and replaced them with warm, vibrant colors that actually brought genuine life into the massive space. But my absolute favorite transformation happened directly beneath my feet. I had the private contractors completely rip out the massive industrial air conditioning units and the heavy electrical wiring Preston had illegally installed in the basement. The dark, suffocating room that once housed hundreds of loud humming computer servers, stealing commercial electricity from the federal grid, was now completely gone. I transformed that massive basement space into a beautiful, bright, colorful playroom for my precious grandchildren. The cold concrete walls were painted cheerful shades of bright yellow and soft blue. The floor was covered in thick, soft play mats, completely surrounded by bookshelves, massive toy boxes, and a small indoor slide. Maya and Leo absolutely loved it, and I saw my grandchildren entirely on my own personal terms. The ridiculous, completely fabricated restraining order Jada had filed was immediately completely dismissed by the family court judge the exact second the massive financial truth was officially legally revealed. Now Maya and Leo spent every other weekend running happily along the private beach and building massive, intricate sandcastles right in my front yard. I was finally the loving grandmother I was always entirely meant to be, completely free from the toxic, heavy shadows of my deeply broken family. The people who had completely conspired to entirely destroy my life were finally paying the absolute heavy price for their massive criminal greed. The wheels of the federal justice system turn very slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. Preston did not get to walk away with a simple fine or a light slap on the wrist. The Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation completely dismantled his entire fraudulent financial life. He was officially convicted of massive interstate wire fraud, severe tax evasion, and federal theft of municipal utilities. The arrogant, sleazy finance bro, who thought he could easily outsmart a certified public accountant, was currently serving a mandatory 5-year sentence in a federal correctional facility. He traded his expensive tailored silk suits and his vintage luxury watches for a standard-issue bright orange jumpsuit and a tiny concrete cell. He would spend the next 5 years completely, entirely locked away, entirely forgotten by the wealthy high society world he so desperately tried to impress. Estelle did not fare much better. After the sheriff completely forcibly evicted her from the beachfront villa, she quickly realized that her wealthy country club friends wanted absolutely nothing to do with a completely broke, entirely disgraced elderly woman. Her fake high society empire completely instantly evaporated. She was entirely, completely destitute. Because I am a woman who firmly believes in completely balancing my moral ledgers, I did not let her starve in the dirty city streets. I used a very small, microscopic fraction of the corporate logistics funds to secure her a tiny single room in a highly modest budget-assisted living facility. It was safe and clean, but it was absolutely entirely basic. There were no massive crystal chandeliers, no imported wine, and absolutely no luxury shopping trips. She spent her days sitting on a cheap vinyl chair, eating bland cafeteria food, and completely bitterly remembering the massive, beautiful empire she threw completely away out of pure, toxic spite. I paid the exact bare minimum required to keep a roof over her head, and I never, ever visited her. As for my daughter Jada, the harsh, brutal slap of absolute reality was exactly the painful medicine she so desperately needed. She finally signed the official lease for the small 2-bedroom apartment I had handed her on the cold, crushed gravel driveway. For the very first time in her entire 34 years of life, she was entirely, completely forced to survive without a massive financial safety net. She traded her expensive luxury sports car for a highly reliable used sedan. She packed away her expensive designer trench coats and bought practical, sensible clothing. Jada finally found a full-time job working as a front desk receptionist at a busy local dental office. She had to wake up at 6 o'clock every single morning, pack simple lunches for her children, and sit entirely quietly behind a cheap laminate desk, answering phones and scheduling dental cleanings for 8 long hours a day. The profound, deep humiliation of working a standard regular job slowly, completely, fundamentally changed her. The sheer arrogant entitlement was entirely slowly washed away by the heavy, exhausting reality of paying her own utility bills and buying her own groceries. When she drove Maya and Leo to the beachfront villa for their weekend visits, she did not complain about the long drive. She did not act superior or demand expensive gifts. She simply dropped them off, smiled quietly, completely, thanked me for my time, and drove entirely back to her modest apartment. She was finally slowly, painfully learning the absolute true meaning of actual hard work and deep, genuine humility. Perhaps one day, years from now, we might actually be able to completely rebuild our fractured relationship. But for now, the strict financial and emotional boundaries I established remained entirely firmly in place. I poured myself a tall glass of fresh iced tea and walked slowly out onto the massive wrap-around wooden balcony of the beachfront villa. The warm, bright afternoon sun felt incredibly beautiful against my skin. The loud crashing sound of the Atlantic Ocean waves hitting the sandy shore was the absolute most peaceful music I had ever heard. I leaned comfortably against the smooth wooden railing and looked out at the endless blue water stretching perfectly toward the distant horizon. I had entirely survived the absolute worst betrayal imaginable, and I had completely rebuilt my entire life on a foundation of absolute, solid, undeniable truth. They thought my silence was weakness. They thought because I did not wear designer labels, I did not know my worth. They thought a quiet older woman from a working-class background could be easily completely discarded and entirely erased. but they completely fundamentally misunderstood the absolute nature of power. The greatest revenge is not screaming loudly in a crowded room. The greatest revenge is not throwing expensive things or breaking heavy windows. The greatest revenge is auditing. It is sitting quietly in the dark, carefully, completely following the hidden money, and legally completely destroying the people who thought they could easily steal your future. Have you ever had to legally outsmart someone who thought they had you beat? Have you ever had to stand up to a deeply toxic family member and completely take back exactly what rightfully belonged to you? Let me know your absolute best stories in the comments section below. I read every single one of them. If you found my deep journey of financial revenge satisfying, please hit the like button right now and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories of absolute resilience and ultimate justice. Share this exact video with any strong woman you know who needs a powerful reminder to never ever back down from a fight. And remember, ladies, always read the fine print.